There are crimes that at first glance are difficult to assess unambiguously. On the one hand, the law of any state guarantees the inviolability of life and health of every person. In contrast, it is often opposed by the testimony of witnesses who minimize the guilt of the attacker. One such controversial case was the crime that occurred in the Mullenix family. Let's try to make sense of it together. Let's find out the reasons for the tension and weigh the responsibility of each person involved. Could it be that the victim is far from innocent? Or is her executioner a wolf in sheep's clothing? An unexpected discovery. On September 14, 2006, Newport Beach was troubled. A woman's body was discovered in a body of water. Apparently, the corpse had been wrapped in a sheet and then placed in a box. When exposed to the water, the unreliable wrapping fell apart and exposed what should have been hidden from view. The body floated to the surface after being in the water for no more than a day. Normally, warm water would speed up the decomposition process. Therefore, the appearance of the dead left much to be desired. Forensic medical examination established the cause of the woman's death was multiple stab wounds. In total, she received about 52 blows, one of which came directly to the eye. Specialists agreed that the injuries were caused by 3 different knives, which means there were at least 2 people who attacked the victim. Naturally, the victim had no identification on her, so the police had to work hard to find out her identity. Among the missing, the profile of the woman was not listed, and no new disappearances have been reported so far. Everything pointed to attempts to cover up the crime committed. Experts also determined that the woman had resorted to plastic surgery during her lifetime. She had breast augmentation. Since the identification of bodies by serial number of implants became a routine procedure, the identity of the murdered was soon established. She was 56-year-old Barbara Mullenix. Who is Barbara Mullenix? The future Mrs. Mullenix was born on May 29, 1950 in Munich, Germany. In her youth, she was very beautiful and sociable. Therefore, she was always in the center of attention. However, these qualities brought her not only success with the opposite sex, but also caused her a lot of trouble. At the age of 18, she was subjected to violence. The girl wanted to forget as quickly as possible what happened, but after a while she learned about the pregnancy. To make an abortion Barbara did not become, she decided to bear the child and give it to a good family. After a while, she got married. In the marriage, she gave birth to a son, Alex Hagwood. However, the marital relationship with her first husband did not last long. At the age of 35, Barbara's attention was attracted by Bruce Mullenix. The man recalled that she was a special woman and immediately liked him. She was characterized by straightforwardness and self-confidence. In November 1987, the couple married. Mr. Mullenix was younger than his wife for 9 years, but it was not particularly felt. Barbara knew how to arouse interest and liked to have fun. After moving to Oklahoma City, a daughter, Rachel, was born to the family. Everything was fine at first, but as time went on, problems began. In the evenings, Bruce could skip on a mug of beer and on weekends to drop in on friends. Barbara at first supported the company, but later became addicted to alcohol. Apparently, the events that occurred in her youth left their imprint. Under the influence of alcohol, the woman, despite the parents' relationship with each other, they loved their daughter very much. They spoiled her and tried to please her in every way. While living in Oklahoma, before the divorce, Rachel had a large room while her father and mother lived in a small one. On the occasion of the girls' birthday parties were always held in the house. Miss Mullenix recalled that she was very close to her mother, even more so than most mothers and daughters. But such a close bond existed only when the woman was sober. The rest of the time, Rachel tried to stay away from her, made no attempt to even talk to her. Our relationship was generally good, but when Barbara drank, she got angry and crazy. She was the first one to get into a fight. Bruce confirmed what his daughter said. Since the house Mullenixoff was located near Hollywood, Barbara was in an extraordinary delight. She loved movies, especially singled out Gone with the Wind. A short time after the move, the woman managed to get a job as an extra, Hollywood dream come true. She felt that in time she would be offered a more serious role, but for now, together with her daughter, took an active part in the masses in movies and TV shows. The scene of the crime was established. Who is the culprit? Police officers could not understand why none of the relatives did not report the disappearance of the murdered woman. Soon, police officers Steve Mack and Joe Cartwright obtained a search warrant for Barbara's home. They hypothesized that since the woman was wrapped in a sheet, the crime could have occurred in bed. So the search for evidence had to begin at Mrs. Mullenix's residence. The police found no one at Barbara's house. At first glance, everything seemed to be in order. There were no visible signs of a crime. However, in one of the rooms on the second floor, a disassembled bed attracted attention. It was without a mattress. It only took a couple hours to reconstruct the scene. The detectives' assumptions had a real basis. Specialists found traces of blood on the walls. Somebody went to a lot of trouble to get rid of the evidence. The blood-stained mattress had apparently been destroyed. There was no doubt that the crime had taken place in this place. The police also believed that the owner of the house knew the perpetrator. Therefore, the first suspect was Mr. Mullenix. It was a strange coincidence that the man was out of town. In addition, just the day after the body was discovered, Bruce returned home. He explained that he was worried because his wife and daughter were not answering their phone calls. The man, of course, had a premonition of something wrong, but in no way expected to hear such a thing. Nevertheless, the news of Barbara's terrible death, the former spouse took it calmly. This also alerted the detectives, so they began to investigate the reason for his departure. Bruce said he was on a business trip. Mr. Mullenix's management confirmed his alibi. The investigation was back to square one. Daughter's love. When Rachel turned 17 years old, she met with Ian Allen. The guy was older than the girl by 4 years. Young people fell madly in love with each other. Ian supported Rachel in everything, even helped with household chores. At first, Barbara liked him. They even spent time together. They went for walks together. They went out together. In order for the lovers to meet freely, Rachel's parents got a special permit. Apparently, so required by law and police officers. Law enforcers often drew attention to the non-standard couple. The girl was allowed to be absent until 1 o'clock in the morning, but she often violated the established schedule, for which she was repeatedly under house arrest. After a while, Mrs. Mullenix noticed that her daughter's feelings were growing into something more. To make matters worse, the two announced that they had decided to get engaged. The move seemed too quick to Barbara. Ian and Rachel had only known each other for 3 months. Barbara didn't want to lose her daughter and the payments she received from her ex-husband. Barbara decided to increase her influence and discipline. Rachel was caught between two fires. She didn't want to offend her mother, whose control was only increasing. Ian, in turn, did not give way. So her mother and Ian began to compete for Rachel's attention. Rachel's fragile psyche suffered with every quarrel and altercation that arose between them. By the end of the summer of 2006, Ian and Barbara's relationship finally deteriorated. The younger Allen was afraid that Rachel's mother would convince her not to date him or forbid her from doing so at all. One day, when Rachel once again violated her schedule for coming home, Barbara exploded. Despite the late hour, Mrs. Mullenix headed to the boyfriend's house and made a scandal. This situation really offended and angered Ian. It became clear to everyone that it couldn't go on like this. On the trail of the fugitives, Bruce was no longer suspected of killing his ex-wife. Detectives turned their attention to Rachel and Ian. Police found out that Barbara had been feeling lonely lately and was drinking a lot. It made her inadequate. Her daughter's attention was slipping away from her. She considered Ian an unworthy companion and Rachel a traitor. That's why Mrs. Mullenix often quarreled with them. Besides, no one knew where the lovers were. They never contacted each other. Given the complicated relationship between Barbara and Ian, the girl's father assumed that Ian was a criminal who was being sought. Rachel, in all likelihood, is not safe either. Otherwise, she would have made herself known, Mr. Mullenix pondered. The police began searching for the missing persons. The Allens' house was also searched. When the detectives checked Ian's computer, they found curious queries on the internet. The guy was researching the route of transportation to the city of Tampa, which is located in Florida. Bruce remembered that before moving in with him, Barbara and Rachel lived there. The couple was reported missing. All police stations in the country received bulletins with a description of the appearance of young people. In addition, the alleged suspect did not disappear without a trace. He left a decent trail behind him. Ian Allen's credit card was used to make a purchase at a gas station in Louisiana. That's also where a surveillance camera captured the guy's truck. Mr. Mullenix's fears were confirmed. Rachel was indeed with him. The only thing left to do was to intercept them. So officers Steve Mack and Joe Cartwright called their colleagues from the next town on the couple's route. Local police shut down highways in search of the van. Ian Allen and Rachel Mullenix were soon caught. The kidnapping story. "Do you know I've been kidnapped?" Rachel shouted when apprehended. "What right did you have to arrest me, to throw me on the ground in handcuffs?" She continued, "I'm not a criminal for you to treat me like this." Detectives Joe and Steve waited for the moment when they could finally question the couple. 2 days later, they arrived at a Louisiana police station. Miss Mullenix insisted that she had not killed her mother. Once investigators pressed the girl, she blamed it on her boyfriend. Rachel claimed that Ian killed her mom and afterwards forced her to run away with him. The police asked for more details about what happened on September 13th, 2006. "I woke up to hear noises in the house. Then I realized that my mother was screaming a lot and calling for help. I rushed to her room. What I saw shocked me. Ian had attacked my mom with a knife. He was stabbing her over and over again. I jumped on him, tried to push him away. He was very strong, so he easily fought me back. I couldn't believe what was happening. I was in a kind of stupor." Rachel began her story. Afterwards, she added that the boyfriend forced her to help cover her tracks. He also insisted that she pack her mother's belongings into bags. Rachel claimed that by doing so, Ian wanted to stage Barbara's unexpected departure. At first, the detectives wanted to believe the girl. The shock she'd been through could send anyone into a state of frustration. But for some reason, the witness to the crime was overly justified. And afterwards, she fiercely insisted that she was not involved in the crime. Furthermore, there were no signs of resistance on Rachel's body. When communicating with Ian Allen, police officers found out an interesting fact. His girlfriend from time to time told about how hard it is for her to live with her mother, how intemperate the woman behaves when she drinks. Instead of reconciling the rivals, Rachel only increased Ian's negative feelings. Certainly some of the facts were true, but some of them were clearly exaggerated. That was why Ian was finally convinced that Barbara would not let them rest. Sometime after the night's quarrel at the Allen house, holding a grudge against Barbara, the lad headed for the Mullenix house. Rachel was under house arrest. I wanted to see her. I knew Barbara wouldn't let me in to see her, so I came secretly. I wanted to sneak into her room quietly, but Barbara spotted me. We got into an argument that escalated into threats. With the folding knife I always carry, I decided to scare her. As soon as the blade was at Mrs. Mullenix's throat, she started screaming. This made me angry and provoked an attack. Things got out of control. It wasn't supposed to happen like that. Rachel really had nothing to do with it, Ian said about the incident. To the surprise of the investigators, the guy did not try to avoid responsibility and confess to everything. Over time, detectives became increasingly convinced that Rachel Mullenix was directly involved in the crime. Her boyfriend was clearly covering for her. CCTV footage from the gas station convenience store where the couple had stopped was scrutinized. Rachel was walking around the store looking for groceries. At that point, she could have safely called for help or run away. But for some reason, she didn't. Moreover, as it turned out later, the girl had the opportunity to call her father, but preferred to make a call to her friend. It was found that a couple of hours after the crime, Miss Mullenix sent a message to Ian Allen. "I love you," she wrote in her text. And that's how Rachel finally lost the trust of the investigation. Rachel's defense. It took 2 years to gather and analyze all the evidence in the Barbara Mullenix murder case. During that time, Rachel turned 19 years old. For any other girl, that's a great age. There is a whole life ahead of her. For young Mullenix, her future depended on the jury's verdict, and she tried to convince everyone of her innocence. When Rachel talked about her childhood, her face lit up. It was obvious that the tender years were happily spent. No doubt Barbara and Bruce had tried to make them so, despite many circumstances. Recalling their relationship with her mother, the daughter said that they were good. They were marred only by alcohol, which was abused by the murdered woman and the boyfriend who appeared over time. At school, I was known as a girl from a not very prosperous family with alcoholic parents. When my father drank, he was still himself. He was kind and considerate, which can't be said for my mom. She described the family atmosphere in court. Her words were confirmed by her friend Kelsey Douglas, who often visited the Mullenix family. Kelsey said that Rachel always tried to please her mother in everything, but apparently there came a point when she could no longer tolerate the harsh control and insults. She admitted to me that she had started drinking from time to time. Rachel didn't know what else to do. She had nowhere else to turn. The alcohol helped relieve tension, to forget for a while about family difficulties, Miss Douglas reported. Alex, Rachel's older brother, strangely enough, also stood up for Rachel. He considered her a victim rather than a murderer. That's why he refused to believe in her guilt to the last. He told the court that his sister had been a good and obedient child. She did well at school, practiced sports and ballet. As for the relationship between Barbara, Rachel, and Ian, Alex noted that at first they were great. All three spent a lot of time together. Barbara's eldest son also reported that their mother abused alcohol and illegal substances before her death. She took stimulants and tranquilizers and often threw loud parties. When Barbara realized that Rachel and her boyfriend wanted to distance themselves, she couldn't accept it. In addition, she found it difficult to get by on her own without alimony and maintenance money. All of this became a source of irritation. According to Alex, Mrs. Mullenix was a very controlling woman. She wanted to be in control of everything. With Rachel, she certainly went overboard in this. My mother loved to be the center of attention. With Ian coming into Rachel's life, her position shifted to the side, Alex summarized. In the involvement of his daughter in the murder of Barbara could not believe and the girl's father. He believed that she loved her mother very much and was incapable of hurting her. In all the time, Rachel did not accuse her mother of the weaknesses that were peculiar to her. She simply reported them as a fact. The girl repeatedly stated that she felt sorry for her. Barbara had a difficult life. About the relationship of her parents, Miss Mullenix recalled with bitterness. Rachel said that the slightest details in the behavior of his father drove his mother into a rage. Barbara often snapped at him, considered a spender. Rachel also told the court that she regretted her love for the young man. She made a big mistake when she started dating him. Their feelings brought discord to her relationship with her mother. Ian felt that my mom was a threat to him. He also wanted to control me like she did. My boyfriend wasn't ideal either. Often hurt and treated me like I was his property. I was torn between the two. Every time there was an argument with my mom, I shared about it. It made it easier for me to get over what happened, Rachel recalled. She concluded by adding that Ian did everything he could to prevent harm to what he thought was his prosecution's position. Sonia Belest, the prosecutor involved in the case, did not believe Rachel's story. She claimed that the girl's angelic appearance was deceptive because she thought she was already smart enough for her age. Therefore, the position Miss Mullenix had chosen was thoroughly refuted. The officers who investigated supported the prosecutor in this. Steve Mack and Joe Cartwright believed that Rachel had some mental health issues. According to them, she was the meanest girl they had ever spoken to. During the interview, the prosecutor competently appealed the inconsistencies in Miss Mullenix's testimony. She inquired of Rachel why she never once called for help when she could have done so, to which the girl replied that she was confused and did not know how to behave in such a situation. The defendant also added that she was frightened by Ian's behavior, which was difficult to predict. The prosecutor drew attention to the fact that Rachel had not a single chance to escape. The girl's actions were atypical for a kidnapped victim. The prosecution believed that Miss Mullenix had not only attacked her mother herself, but had planned the crime in advance. When they tried to ask Rachel about the details of Ian's stabbing, Rachel was unable to answer. Her testimony changed and contradicted each other more than once. During the trial, the defendant stated that she was not present during the argument between Barbara and Ian. Allegedly, she simply left them in her room, hoping they would calm down. Only then did she hear screaming and the sounds of a struggle, after which she came running back and saw that the guy attacked her mom with a knife. However, Rachel's version did not coincide with the evidence that was found at the scene of the crime. The forensic report clearly established that Barbara's attacker was not alone. Specialists estimated that 5 minutes had been enough to kill the woman. Rachel continued to insist on her own innocence. Questions: why she didn't call emergency services, why she wrote a love text to the killer boyfriend, were frozen in the air unanswered. The forensic psychiatrist who worked with Miss Mullenix diagnosed her with borderline personality disorder. He believed she truly loved her mother, but she hated her equally as much. By the way, people with this kind of personality are prone to erratic behavior. It's often destructive to both the unsub and others. Bitter verdict. It took the jury 3 days to reach a final verdict. Ian Allen was found guilty of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison. For Rachel Mullenix, the court's verdict was no consolation either. She was found to be involved in the death of her mother and qualified the act as first-degree murder. The girl was sentenced to life in prison. Her first chance for parole will come when the inmate turns about 41 years old. After the verdict was announced, the prosecutor said she was relieved. There is no question that Ian Allen and Rachel Mullenix killed Barbara, Sonia Balest concluded. For a mother, such a death was a true betrayal. The day Barbara brought her daughter into the world, she signed her own death warrant. The child she loved immensely became her light and darkness at the same time. Undoubtedly, Mrs. Mullenix made many mistakes in her life. She was not an ideal mother, but she never abandoned her children to perdition. Barbara's jealousy and fear of being alone hardened the woman's already strong character. But people in love always have a choice. They could simply leave to preserve their right to their feelings. In time, things would have calmed down, relationships would have mended. Perhaps Barbara would have switched to something else, and the grandchildren Rachel and Ian would give her would be her outlet. The story of a British woman named Dina Thompson, nicknamed the Black Widow, became, in the mid-20s, one of the main topics for numerous documentaries, TV shows, and crime programs. This pleasant at first glance woman turned out to be a pathological liar, fraudster, and led to the grave at least one man who loved her wholeheartedly. Dina repeatedly managed to escape punishment, but in 2003 she was still in the dock. Despite the fact that she was facing life imprisonment, the court was surprisingly mild, allowing parole. So in 2022, one of the most dangerous criminals who miraculously survived her ex-husband characterized as pure evil, went free. Thompson's victims were always men, which according to experts, may indicate some kind of trauma received by the criminal in childhood or adolescence. However, Dina's early years were quite prosperous. The girl was born in 1960 in North London and brought up in a full family. Her parents lived modestly, but did everything to ensure that their daughter did not need anything. The head of the family worked as a prison guard, seriously engaged in sports, and from childhood, motivated Dina to attend gyms, where she diligently engaged in gymnastics. In addition, the man often participated in all kinds of sports competitions, including those held in other countries, and constantly took his daughter with him. Dina grew up quite active, cheerful, and sociable child. She easily made acquaintances and friendships with peers, and with age learned to quickly win the attention of guys she liked. After school, the girl went to college, and then got a job in one of the local banks. At the age of 22 years, Dina met her future first spouse, Lee Wyatt. They first met thanks to the cousin of the guy, who organized a couple blind date. Between young people immediately burst feelings, and a stormy romance began. They got along well, spent a lot of time together, and 2 years later officially legalized their relationship. After the wedding, the couple moved to a provincial place called Yapton, with a population of only 3,000 people. Soon the couple had a son, and the new parents began to slowly develop their own business, creating authors' soft toys, the images of which they invented together. In parallel, Dina worked as a cashier in a construction organization, and their family, according to neighbors, was quite happy and prosperous. The head of the family was often away on business matters and was absent from home for long periods of time. With neighbors, the man practically did not communicate, but his wife, on the contrary, quickly made acquaintances with local residents. Dina knew how to win the favor of others, easily rubbed in the trust. In addition, men often paid attention to the attractive young woman and even tried to court her. At the dawn of the 90 AS, Dina met with a young journalist, whose name was Julian Webb. The man offered her to work as a model for advertising clothing and household appliances, and soon her pictures were painted on the pages of local newspapers and magazines. Dina was eager to pose and felt at ease in front of the camera. By then, Lee Wyatt hadn't been home for months, and none of the neighbors had any idea where he was or why he'd been gone so long. His wife, apparently, did not miss him too much, having had an affair with Julian. Just 3 months after meeting, the journalist introduced the chosen one to his parents, saying that he was going to marry her. Subsequently, Webb's mother recalled that she was quite surprised by such a hasty decision of her son. In addition, a potential daughter-in-law, who was a few years older than Julian, did not inspire her confidence. When the neighbors learned about the upcoming wedding, they were puzzled because they knew that Dina is already legally married to another man. However, her husband hadn't been home for months, and no one knew for sure where he was or what was wrong with him. As it later turned out, all this time, Lee was in the small town of New Quay, located almost on the other side of the country. There he lived under an assumed name and false documents, hiding, as he thought, from the mafia. In fact, the man became a victim of skillful lies of his wife, who convinced him that their family was in mortal danger, and escape, this is the only way out. The couple, as mentioned, were engaged in creating authors' soft toys, and their most successful creation was Leprechaun Sean, which sold well and gained a certain popularity. In early 1991, Dinah told her husband that their creation was interested in the corporation Disney and is ready to pay £50 million for the opportunity to use this character. But the joy was short-lived, and soon the woman reported that representatives of the criminal world, having learned about the big deal, want to get most of the money, threatening otherwise to kill the whole family. Dina also came up with a way out of the situation, convincing her husband that he needed to hide. Lee quickly acquired fake documents and went on the run. But before this cunning woman persuaded Lee to write several threatening letters to her and make several similar records of phone calls, which allegedly were supposed to be proof that he hates his wife, so that the mafia to stop pursuing her. The trusting husband, not suspecting anything, did as his wife told him to do and then fled. In a foreign city with no home or friends, Lee was ready to take on any job, and all the money he earned was sent to his wife and son so that his family did not need anything. Most likely, this escape really saved his life, but the threat came not from fictional bandits, but from his own wife. In November of the same 1991, Dina married her new favorite Julian, and the wedding couple played on the very money that faithfully sent home deceived Lee. Webb was madly in love and happy, but soon after the wedding neighbors began to notice that the woman regularly visits the lovers while her husband at work. And after a while, she informed Julian that she was terminally ill and was fired from her job because of it. The story with a fatal diagnosis and dismissal turned out to be a lie from the first to the last word, and it also turned out that from the accounts of the company where Dina worked, a large amount of money was missing, and the main suspect in this crime was herself. Then the woman accused her first husband, Lee Wyatt, who allegedly forced her to go to the crime by threats. As evidence, she provided the very letters and audio recordings that she herself had previously convinced him to do. Wyatt himself returned home as soon as he learned that his spouse had remarried. The case was limited to a scandal, and although Dina claimed that he had beaten her, there was no evidence of this. Nevertheless, the detectives sided with the woman, so Lee again had to leave Yapton in a hurry. In love, Julian's situation did not embarrass at all, and he gave his wife all his savings for the treatment of fictitious her fatal disease. But time passed, the money melted, and the husband began to wonder how the treatment is progressing. It turned out that the woman did not have a single medical document confirming her diagnosis. Relationships in the family broke down. Neighbors heard how the spouses fought loudly, and in June 1994, the day after celebrating Julian's 31st birthday, he died suddenly. The evening before the tragedy, his mother called him, but Dina reported that her husband wasn't feeling well and couldn't answer. Julian's mother asked her sister-in-law to call an ambulance, but she ignored her request. The expert examination showed that the young man died of a drug overdose, but for some reason no one saw a criminal trace in this tragedy, and his wife insisted that her husband voluntarily decided to kill himself. In addition, she demanded that Julian's body was cremated, but his parents were strongly opposed to this. Also, after the death of her husband, Dina tried to get a large insurance payment, but she was denied because their marriage was recognized as invalid. At the funeral, Dina did not even try to cry or depict grief. On the contrary, she chose a frank outfit and behaved defiantly. Almost immediately afterward, the widowed woman began to spin numerous novels and affairs. She openly brought lovers to her house, not hiding from the neighbors. Only in 1997, Dina filed a divorce from her first legal husband, and less than a year later she met Richard Thompson, who immediately managed to charm. Dina, not thinking long, told the new lover that suffers from a serious illness, and she has to live a very short time. Blinded by love, the man said that he would turn the last months of her life into a fairy tale and is ready to spend all his savings for this. Wedding couple played in one of the best hotels in Florida. There they spent their honeymoon and then returned to their native England, settling on its southern coast in the city of Brighton. According to Richard's memories, his wife literally bewitched him with her care and support, and she also skillfully pretended to share all his views and aspirations. He has always dreamed of owning his own boat to professionally engage in fishing, and his wife not only approved this idea, but also offered him to open a company that provides a yacht for rent so that he could not only fish himself, but also to teach it to others. Less than a year after the wedding, during a New Year's Eve celebration, Dina gave her husband a romantic dinner. They took a bath together, and afterward, she said she had prepared a special gift and asked her husband's permission to tie him up. Richard, not suspecting anything wrong, readily agreed. But as soon as he had the ropes on his hands, a blindfold over his eyes, and a gag in his mouth, he was suddenly struck hard on the head with a bat, followed by another. Luckily, Richard not only did not lose consciousness, but managed to free himself quickly. Then Dina grabbed a knife and wounded her husband in the shoulder. Richard knocked the weapon out of his wife's hands, immobilized her, and called the police. Dina burst into tears, admitted that all this time she had lied to him and spent all his money. However, already at the station, she pulled herself together and began to claim that it was her husband who attacked her, and she was only defending herself. The story did not end there, and a day later, a real estate agent came to Richard's house to sell the house. He had an appointment with the landlady, who warned him that her husband had left for America on a business trip. At that moment, Richard realized that his wife was planning to kill him, sell the house, and run away with the money. No one would look for Thompson himself for a long time, thinking that he had gone across the ocean. In the course of court proceedings, it turned out that the woman had withdrawn all the money from her husband's bank accounts, forging his signature, and also used his credit cards, accumulating a lot of debts. The case gained a wide resonance, and other men began to apply to the police, former lovers of Dina, whom she deceived and cleaned to the thread, telling about a fictitious, incurable disease. Then also remembered, and the first husband of the woman who had to hide for many years, first from her fictitious pursuers from the mafia, and then from the police. It was finally revealed that it was Dina who stole the company in which he worked, accusing her husband of everything. However, the jury, despite the presence of irrefutable evidence, acquitted the woman in the case of the attack on her husband, Richard Thompson, and Richard himself was accused of seeking to attract attention to himself, making up such a story. Nevertheless, Dina was found guilty of numerous financial frauds and sentenced to nearly 4 years in prison. The hype around Dina Thompson also reminded about the strange, sudden death of her second husband, journalist Julian Webb. The woman herself told completely different versions and circumstances of his death. She said that her husband was poisoned by steroids, which he took to keep himself in shape, then claimed that he drank a lot and fell asleep in the sun, getting sunstroke, and at the inquest, and in general, said that he took his own life. Despite her caution, Dina once confessed to her best friend that she had poisoned her husband by putting potent drugs in a spicy dish that he adored. The police managed to track down the owner of the diner where Julian often dined and ordered food to take home. He recalled that the day before the tragedy, Webb's wife took out rice and chicken curry. And then the investigators guessed that it was this seasoning that interrupted the specific flavor of the drugs. In connection with the newly discovered circumstances, a new investigation was initiated, and Julian's body was exhumed and sent for examination. As it turned out, the man was poisoned by a large dose of powerful antidepressants added to his favorite dish with curry, and strengthened their effect, aspirin, which Dina dissolved in her husband's drink. At the time of the call to his mother, Webb was still alive, and he could be saved, but it was not part of the plans of his wife. In 2003, the Black Widow was finally brought to trial. The investigator at the hearing characterized her as the most dangerous woman he had ever had to deal with, and the judge noted that she was a skilled and very dodgy liar. Dina Thompson was sentenced to life in prison, but with parole eligibility after 16 years. The story of the crimes of the Black Widow formed the basis of numerous documentary detectives actively discussed in TV shows and used in the press. Even after Dina was behind bars, detectives unearthed another dark story from her past. As it turned out, one of her first lovers disappeared without a trace, and to this day has not been found alive or dead. The young man's name was Stoyan Kostov, and he lived in Bulgaria, where Dina herself trained as a gymnast in the late 70s. Between them began a romantic relationship, and afterwards, the guy disappeared forever. The investigation does not exclude that Dina is directly related to this case, and Kostov became one of her first victims, but it was not possible to prove anything. While serving her sentence, Thompson worked with a prison psychologist and underwent rehabilitation courses. Despite her exemplary behavior and the right words about re-education and realization of her mistakes, Dina, according to the detective in charge of her case, does not feel remorse and pangs of conscience, and therefore can re-offend. Nevertheless, in the summer of 2022, the 61-year-old Black Widow was released from prison. After learning about it, Richard Thompson said that now he will not feel safe, because he does not know what to expect from his former spouse. Now, Dina is obliged to report to the police about all her connections and relationships, observe curfew, and report on all financial transactions. She is also forbidden to approach her ex-husbands and lovers affected by her actions. She is forced to wear a special tracking bracelet on her leg that records all her movements. A few months after her release, Thompson was captured by journalists while returning from a store with shopping in a large bag. Curiously, on the ring finger of her right hand was the case of Sarai Sierra. She went across the ocean to meet her death. The high-profile case of an American girl photographer named Sarai Sierra 10 years ago stirred the world and brought the intelligence services of two countries located on different continents to their feet. The U.S. citizen disappeared without a trace during her photo tour in Istanbul, as if vanishing into thin air. This story was widely covered in the press, and the situation and circumstances were so strange that it gave rise to a lot of rumors and conspiracy theories. Despite active, large-scale, and timely searches, it was unfortunately not possible to find the girl alive. Her body was found in the historic center of the city, near the walls of Sarajevo. But how did it happen that in a white day in a popular tourist spot so simply took a person's life and no one even noticed it? To understand this case, it is necessary to restore the whole chain of events that led to this tragedy, and now we will try to do it together. Sarai Sierra. Early years. Sarai Sierra was born in New York in 1979 on November 9th and became the second child in a large family. She was brought up together with her older brother David and younger sister Christina. Their parents, Dennis and Bethany Sime Jimenez, were of Puerto Rican descent, but emigrated to the United States in 1973, settling in Manhattan, where their children were born. Shortly after moving, the couple joined the local Protestant community and became evangelical Christians. They brought up all their children in strictness, following the religious canons of their adopted faith. The family attended church regularly, socialized with other members of the community, and the children attended Sunday school. Sarai grew up to be an active, creative person, and also stood out for her strong-willed but rather complex character. Unlike her younger sister Christina, who was a quiet, obedient, and very modest girl, Sarai was considered a rebel and a hooligan. But at the same time, she respected her parents, recognizing their undisputed authority. In the Jimenez family home, there were strict rules to which all members of the family obeyed. This applied to the daily routine of its inhabitants, many everyday moments, as well as norms of behavior. For example, the daughters were not allowed to socialize with boys, go on dates, or be out of the house after 9 o'clock in the evening. All their friendly contacts were controlled, and parents always knew where and with whom their children were. In fact, Sarai's entire life revolved around home, school, and church, and her social circle was limited to the people in those places. The active, energetic, socially oriented girl was bored and cramped within the framework in which she was kept, but her parents were sure that they were doing the right thing for the good of their children. During her school years, Sarai planned to enter a pedagogical university and become a teacher in the field of culture or arts. But closer to the end of her studies, she became interested in psychology and began to think about connecting her future profession with this field of activity. During one of the meetings of the religious community, slender, dark-haired beauty attracted the attention of a young man named Stephen Sierra. He was the first to approach her and made an excuse to talk to her. Sarai was barely 18 years old at the time, and her new acquaintance was 7 years older than her. But despite the age difference, with the approval of their parents, the young people began dating. Stephen immediately liked Dennis and Bethany, who thought that this decent, polite, and honest young man would be a good match for their daughter. Most likely, Sarai was not madly in love with the guy, but agreed to marry him, mostly for the sake of finally moving out of her parents' house and freeing herself from such tight control. It should be noted that Sarai had a good relationship with her parents, but she wanted some freedom to live her own life and plan her own future. Less than a year after meeting, in February 1999, the couple got married. The bride was 19 years old at the time, and the groom was 26 years old. Soon after, the couple moved to the state of Michigan, where Stephen's parents lived. For Sarai, this move was a real event, because before that she spent all her conscious life practically without staying in his native New York. The change of scenery did her good, and in a new place she seemed to revitalize. Sarai enjoyed shopping for things for her new home, making it cozy, enjoying new acquaintances and new places. She got a job at a local dental office as a receptionist and was thinking about getting a college degree after all. However, Sarai soon became pregnant and had children, first a boy and then a girl. Entry into the university had to be postponed because the young woman was completely absorbed in motherhood and enjoyed it. A couple of years later, the family Sierra, with 2 children, again decided to move, and this time they went to sunny California, settling in the picturesque neighborhood of Silver Lake in Los Angeles. Here, Stephen was offered a job, but soon the couple realized that the money he was earning, they do not have enough to live on. Then, having consulted, they decided to return back to New York and settled in a modest rented apartment located near the house of the Jimenez family. At that time, the couple faced serious financial problems. Sarai was still at home with the children, and her husband had to survive on casual income, because of which they periodically had to get into debt. The situation began to change for the better when the children went to school and the young mother got a job at an advertising agency. Stephen had by then found a permanent job as a bus driver on one of the city routes. A new hobby. Closer to 30 years, when the children have already grown up and life stabilized, Soraya again remembered her long-standing plans to get a higher education. By that time, she was not interested in the pedagogical faculty at all, and Soraya chose the Faculty of Psychology, entering one of the local universities. However, Soraya soon grew cold to her studies, and the boring hours of lectures caused her boredom. She decided to look for herself in another sphere and choose an occupation that would be to her liking, inspire her, and allow her to express herself. Since Soraya had always been a creative person, good at drawing and seeing the beauty in everything, she became interested in photography and soon joined a well-known New York photography community to be able to develop in this direction. She was widely recognized as having a real talent. Soraya was able to choose the right angles and harmoniously build compositions, making incredible in its beauty shots. Even professionals praised her work for her creativity and vision. In early 2012, on the advice of her colleagues, Soraya created a page in one of the popular social networks, where she began to post her work. The success did not take long, and other users began to subscribe to the young woman's profile by the thousands, enthusiastically commenting on each of her works. In a few months, she became a real star, and the number of her subscribers continued to grow exponentially. Such a furor literally dizzy her head. Soraya felt that she could achieve more, that she wanted to develop and improve in this direction. So she made a proposal to organize a group photo tour in search of beautiful and unusual locations in different parts of the world. Soraya Sierra started with small trips around her native country, specializing in shooting architectural ensembles and various historical monuments. Her images were a great success, and she decided not to stop. Soraya wanted to travel to Istanbul, one of the most ancient and beautiful cities in the world, to capture its sights and historical sites. It should be noted that her parents were not thrilled with this idea, because she had never left the country before and never left home for so long. But Soraya was adamant. In addition, she had to be accompanied on the trip by her best friend Magdalena. As it turned out, Soraya's family was in crisis, and her relationship with her husband was falling apart. Perhaps part of the reason for her idea of a photo tour on the other side of the world was a desire to get away, change her surroundings, and reflect on what was happening in her family from a distance. Soraya had lived in a strict framework for too long, and now she was eager to do something she wanted to do, something her soul demanded. During that period, her husband's social media account began to show strange postings and statuses. He philosophized about the value of marriage, about love and mutual respect between husband and wife, and also noted that he would not cheat on his other half, even if the marriage hangs in the balance. In one of the posts, Stephen opaquely hinted that his spouse was unfaithful to him, but a few hours later he deleted the publication, leaving the questions that appeared under it unanswered. Stephen obviously didn't feel happy and loved and tried to show it to everyone through his social media page. Soraya was experiencing similar torment, but kept it to herself, trying not to complain and focus on her creativity. The long-awaited trip. Shortly before the planned tour, Soraya learned that her best friend would not be able to travel with her because of problems at work. The young woman was very upset, but did not change her plans because she had been going to it for too long. Soraya's relatives were concerned about the fact that she would fly alone to a foreign country across the ocean, but she assured them that everything would be fine, promising to call, write, and send photos every day. In addition, Soraya was also planning to visit Germany and Austria, where she had several commercial photography assignments already scheduled. Her entire trip was literally scheduled by the hour, and she was not going to deviate from the schedule. On January 7, 2013, a young American woman boarded a flight from New York to Istanbul. She was carrying a small amount of cash, a smartphone, a tablet, a fairly inexpensive DSLR camera, and several lenses designed for professional photography. Upon arrival, Sarai called her family, informing them that she had arrived safely and was on her way to check into the hotel she had booked in advance. It should be noted that she had a rather modest budget, so she had to stay in a remote area, which the locals considered unsafe. After leaving her things in the room and changing her clothes from the road, Sarai Sierra immediately went to the nearest metro station to get to the historic city center. She wandered the streets of Istanbul until nightfall, photographing its beauty and savoring every shot she took. In the evenings, she would call her parents and husband via video call, sharing her impressions and her plans for the next day. She would also process fresh shots and post them to her social media accounts. New friend. As it later turned out, Sarai was accompanied in Istanbul by a young man named Taylan. They met on social networks in the middle of 2012, and it was Taylan who convinced the American to fly to Turkey. For several months, they actively corresponded and became very close during this time. Sarai completely trusted her new acquaintance. They saw each other almost every day, and together visited various attractions. The guy was a native of Istanbul, so he knew the city like the back of his hand, and arranged for Sarai exciting excursions to the most interesting, sometimes unusual places. After a week's stay in Turkey, the photographer had a trip planned to a couple of European countries, where, as I said, she arranged several commercial photo shoots. Here, Sarai saved money on hotel accommodation because she agreed to be hosted by her subscribers who had been following her work for a long time. These moments were negotiated and agreed in advance, so at the airport in Vienna, she was met by a young man in whose house she stayed for a couple of days. The Austrian acquaintance was a few years older than Sarai. He himself was fond of photography and admired her works, so he was eager to communicate personally with such a talented photographer. The trip went according to plan. Sarai visited all the places she had planned and met everyone she had arranged to meet. On the third day, she flew to Berlin, where she was also met at the airport by her subscribers who gave her a tour of the city. After finishing all her business in Germany, the photographer went to the airport again and returned to Istanbul, where she planned to stay for 2 more days before returning home. Upon arrival, she was met by Taylan, with whom they spent the day driving around the city, and afterward they went to a popular local bar together. It was after midnight when the Turk escorted Sarai to her hotel, where they said goodbye. A mysterious disappearance in a foreign country. On January 21, 2013, the last day of her photo tour, Sarai called her parents and husband to let them know what time and what flight she was taking to New York. She had never been away from home for so long before, so everyone was happy that her trip was finally coming to an end. However, before leaving, Sarai decided to take one last walk around the city and take some more beautiful shots for her account. At the appointed time, Sarai's father arrived at the airport to pick up his daughter because her husband was at work and could not make it. He arrived early because he was afraid of getting stuck in traffic and not being on time. They announced the arrival of the plane. All the passengers got off, but Sarai was not among them. Her phone was also unavailable, and all attempts to contact her were futile. Then Dennis waited a little longer, and then, concerned about his daughter's absence, went to the representatives of the airline. However, Dennis was literally shocked when they informed him that a passenger with such a name had not boarded the aircraft. Dennis immediately called Stephen and informed him of what had happened, saying that it was necessary to immediately organize a search. Sarai's husband first contacted the hotel where his wife was staying in Istanbul, but there he was told that her belongings were still in the room, and she had not checked out, although she should have done so yesterday, and did not appear in the hotel for the second day. This information caused a real panic among the family members because they did not know where Sarai was and did not understand how to proceed. Stephen, who had access to his wife's accounts, decided to check them, looking for some clues. There, he found his wife's correspondence with Thailand, which seemed very suspicious to him. Nevertheless, he decided to contact the Turk himself to find out what he knew. But Thailand claimed that he had seen the missing woman the day before the planned departure, and before the flight she did not even call him, although she promised. Sarai's family immediately reported the incident to the American embassy in Turkey, and a day later, a large-scale search operation was organized on the spot, for which a special unit was even created. Almost immediately, Sarai's husband and parents flew to Istanbul, deciding that they needed to be personally involved in the search. Besides, not much time had passed since her disappearance, and there was a high probability of finding her alive. Investigating police officers. The first thing decided to determine the social circle of the American and talk to those who saw her shortly before she disappeared. To testify were called employees of the hotel where she stayed, as well as her friend Thailand. The hotel manager stated that he last saw Ms. Sierra the night before she left. She was leaving with a small bag and a camera in hand. She was supposed to check out later, but never showed up at the hotel again. And the next morning, they received a call from her worried husband, who informed them that Sarai's belongings and documents were still at the hotel. The receptionist also described the clothes Saraya was wearing that day. The situation with Tilan was much more interesting and ambiguous. First, the guy's name was actually Tarkan, and why he introduced himself to his new acquaintance with an assumed name was unclear. Secondly, they had been in close contact for several months before their meeting, and Sarai had arrived in Istanbul at his invitation. All of this suggested that there was a romantic relationship between them, but Tarkan himself categorically denied it, claiming that they were only friends. The next stage of the investigation was to recreate in as much detail as possible the route that Sarai took that day. For this purpose, her cell phone data was checked, as well as street CCTV footage. Thus, it was established that the young woman took the subway to Sultanahmet district, visited the promontory between the Bosphorus Strait and the Golden Horn Bay, visited Eminönü Market, but there she was lost in a large crowd of tourists. Then her trail was retraced to the subway, where she was going down to go to the Sarayburnu walls, but she soon disappeared from the camera's view again. Frightening discovery. The searchers decided to go to the ruins of the Sarayburnu walls to comb the area and interview people. Maybe someone remembered a lone woman with a camera in her hands. After several hours, the search was successful, if you can call it that. The body of a young woman with no signs of life was found near the ruins of the walls of ancient Constantinople. It was covered with an old dirty blanket, so it was not conspicuous. Investigators assumed that it was in this blanket that Sierra was brought here. Forensics believe the body had been there for about 10 to 12 days before it was found. There were no clothes on the lower part of the body, which immediately prompted a version of violence, which was later confirmed by experts. The autopsy revealed that Sierra died from a blow to the head with a blunt, heavy object, but there were also several hematomas on her body and a couple of ribs were broken. In addition, pathologists found particles of epithelium and blood under Sarai's fingernails, and this indicated that she had defended herself and scratched the perpetrator. The crime looked strange and even ridiculous because the victim's bag, smartphone, and camera were stolen. But at the same time, she was wearing gold earrings, wedding ring, and expensive watch, which immediately caught the eye. All that could be found on camera footage from the area was a young woman who looked like Sarai, filming something on her phone, and then a man approached her, either hitting her or pushing her, and then they both disappeared from the camera's view. The attacker was not immediately identified. Versions and conspiracy theories. Almost instantly, the information was leaked to the media, almost provoking an international scandal. The whole point is that from the TV screens and from the pages of newspapers every day appealed to people to help in the search for the missing American woman and tell if anyone knows anything. But at the same time, the investigation was silent. And when the body was discovered, The situation became even more confusing. Many people wondered why a young married woman suddenly flew alone across the ocean. What was she doing in Istanbul and Europe? And with what funds had she traveled there? It all looked suspicious indeed, and investigators initially thought that Sarai had gone to see her lover, Taylan, aka Tarkan, and afterward flew to another man in Austria. But both her buddies denied being intimate with the victim. Later, it turned out that the man who sheltered Sarai in Vienna has a criminal record, in connection with which there was a version that he could use the American as a drug courier. But a thorough check did not confirm this speculation. There were also rumors that Sarai could work for the U.S. intelligence services and to collect information in other countries. Allegedly, hence the money for intercontinental flights. This version looked untenable, so it was not even seriously considered. The investigation of this high-profile case was carried out by Turkish special services together with the FBI, but at first, they did not have any serious leads. Only a few weeks later, the police came to the alleged perpetrator, a previously convicted and unemployed guy named Tal Salih, collecting waste paper on the city streets. But it was not possible to communicate with him because almost immediately after the crime, he borrowed money from relatives and left the country, presumably going to Hatay province, where he illegally crossed the border with Syria. After obtaining a warrant, police searched the suspect's home, where they took a sample of his DNA and compared it with skin particles and seminal fluid found on the body of the murdered woman. After that, the last doubts were dispelled. Tal Salih was the perpetrator of the crime. In addition, the victim's phone was last switched on in the neighborhood where he lived. When it became known that the criminal fled to Syria, the special services lost all hope of getting to him. But soon, fate itself gave them an unexpected surprise. This guy was detained while trying to cross the border illegally again, but this time he was trying to return to Turkey. He joined the rebels in Syria and obtained firearms, but was injured in the conflict and decided he would be safer at home. However, he made his way back with his weapon, which was the initial reason for his arrest. But the local police soon realized who was in their hands and immediately reported him to the security services. When Tal Salih was brought in for questioning, his story was literally discouraging with horrific details. He saw a young woman on a hiking trail along the walls of Sarajevo, and for a few minutes he simply admired her and watched her taking pictures. When he got closer, Sarai tried to ask him something using gestures, but due to the language barrier, he never understood what she wanted. However, he noticed a brand new iPhone in her hands and an expensive camera around her neck. As Sarai walked on, he followed her, already determined to rob her. It was getting dark outside, and there were no other people near the wall, at least in sight. At one point, Sierra turned around and, as it seemed to him, took a picture of him. That action became a trigger of sorts. Tal Salih grabbed a boulder and lunged at Sierra, hitting her hard in the head. After that, they literally rolled together down to the ruins of the wall, hence probably bruises and broken ribs on Sarai's body. Then Tal Salih, taking advantage of the unconsciousness of the victim, decided to commit violent acts of intimate nature. The perpetrator then delivered another severe blow to the head to finish Sarai off. Tal Salih took the victim's bag, her camera and phone, and walked away. On his way, he came across the same blanket that someone had thrown away and decided to return to cover the victim's body with it. By that time, it was finally dark outside, and the chances of meeting someone at the wall were minimal. Once back, the perpetrator dragged the body a little to the side, positioning it so that it would not be visible from the hiking path. He then covered it with a blanket and left. Surprisingly, while the search for the American woman was going on, the perpetrator visited the crime scene one more time to make sure Saraya was dead and her body was lying where he had left it. When Tal Salih learned from the news that his victim had been found, he realized that the police would quickly get on his trail, so he decided to flee the country, borrowing money from his sister, who always felt sorry for him. By the way, he was never able to realize the stolen goods. The camera was broken in the process of falling. The smartphone had a password, which the criminal unsuccessfully tried to unravel while at home, hence the signal, and all the other stolen items he threw away when he went on the run. The defendant did not deny his guilt, and judging from his accounts, he did not regret what he had done, nor did he suffer from pangs of conscience. As key evidence, DNA forensic evidence was presented, which confirmed that it was his skin that was found under the fingernails of the murdered woman, and his seminal fluid was found on her body. Also, Sarai's cell phone was last switched on in the vicinity of his residence. In addition, the case file was supplemented with a video surveillance camera recording of the attack itself. After all the evidence was presented, it was decided that a psychiatric examination was necessary because of the belief that Tal Sali was insane. This idea was suggested by his actions, behavior, and the calmness with which he described in detail the atrocities he had committed. But experts concluded that he was sane and fully aware of his actions when he attacked his victim. In the summer of 2014, the judge finally delivered the final verdict. Tal Sali was found guilty on all counts against him and sentenced to life imprisonment. Sarai's relatives considered this decision fair. The body of the murdered American woman, after all the necessary expert examinations, was transported to her homeland in New York, and all related costs were borne by a Turkish airline. Sarai was buried in compliance with all religious rites and traditions. Family members of the deceased created an internet site dedicated to her memory, where they published her works, which had not appeared anywhere before. The photos were a great success, and people from different parts of the world were ready to buy them. The money received from the sale of pictures, the family saved for college education for orphaned children Sarai. As for Stephen, he categorically denied that in his and his wife's family life was a crisis, which pushed the young woman on that fateful trip. Soon, Stephen became close to a girl from the Christian community who supported him in a difficult period and often came to his home to help him with his children and household chores. 2 weeks before the first anniversary of his wife's funeral, Stephen walked down the aisle with his new chosen one. When the perpetrator was finally sentenced, Stephen was already married and preparing to become a father again. The story of Sarai Sierra was the basis for a series of TV programs and talk shows, as well as detective documentaries. In addition, future projects have also been based on it. The tragic story of the Rose family is considered one of the most bizarre and confusing crimes committed in America in recent years. This case struck investigators not only by its cynicism and cruelty, but also by the fact that the victims and the alleged perpetrators were close relatives. Despite the fact that many years have passed since the crime was committed, and the perpetrator has long served his harsh sentence behind bars, there are still many questions and white spots in this story. Many still do not believe in the fairness of the court's verdict. Now let's get down to business. It was an ordinary average family living in a provincial suburb of Bristol in the state of Tennessee, and had never been on the radar of law enforcers before. The family was headed by elderly couple Curtis and Lena Maria Rose, who had lived together for over 40 years. They had 2 grown daughters and 6 grandchildren, but we will only look at those family members who were directly involved in this high-profile case. So, at the time of the crime, in the house and the surrounding area were the elderly owners themselves, Curtis and Lena Maria Rose, their eldest daughter, 39-year-old Tosha Milhorn with her husband James, and 6 children. 2 of the children were Tosha and James's shared children, while the other 3 children were their heirs from a previous relationship. Also present in the house was a neighborhood girl who stopped by to play with them. It is worth noting that Tosha and James and their children lived at Tosha's parents' house for about 2 months, as their own home was undergoing renovations at the time. Later, another key player in those events, 19-year-old Seth Denton, arrived at the house. He was Toshi's eldest son, but his relationship with his mother and stepfather was strained, to put it mildly, and they avoided communicating with each other in every possible way, and their last meeting ended in tragedy. According to neighbors, the Rose couple was quite happy and prosperous. Their daughter Tosha was also happily married to James, who worked as an auto mechanic and was fond of restoring vintage cars. It was the Rose couple's family home that was the scene of the carnage. Police officers who arrived on the call later dubbed it the worst crime scene they had ever seen and the bloodiest in the history of their quiet county. The bodies of two women, Lena Maria and Tosha, a mother and daughter, were found in the house, shot almost point blank. Tosha was in a chair at the dining room table, and her mother was lying on the floor between the table and the refrigerator. Also lying on the doorstep of the house was the critically wounded James, Tosha's husband, who was quickly rushed to the hospital. But despite the efforts of the doctors, the man soon died of extensive internal injuries and massive blood loss. None of the children in the house were injured. It is likely that they were not targeted by the shooter, or were simply not in his field of vision at the time of the massacre of the adults. Almost immediately after the crime, the police received 2 phone calls, one after the other. The first call came from the owner of the house, Curtis Rose, who said that his eldest grandson Seth had committed a shooting in the house and then fled the scene. But soon there was a call from Seth himself, who told a different version of what happened and blamed everything on his grandfather Curtis. In addition, it turned out that Seth was wounded in the arm and shot him Curtis. However, he did not deny it, saying that he was trying to detain his grandson and not let him escape from the scene of the massacre. The alleged killer, Seth Denton, was arrested in the hospital, where he sought medical help in connection with the wound. Then the investigation was to restore the chain of tragic events and find out what really happened in the house of the Rose family. Surprisingly, but for the basis of the investigation was taken only one version, and the second version was taken seriously only a few years later. On August 29, 2015, around 6 o'clock in the evening, residents of houses located near the scene of the crime heard a series of gunshots. No one paid much attention to it, as there were forests around where hunting of wild animals and birds was allowed. Later, one of the neighbors noted that he was a little alarmed by the number of shots, and then the silence, but he did not consider it a good reason to call the police. Another neighbor testified at trial that in addition to the gunshots, he heard screaming and went out on the porch of his house to see what was going on. At that point, he saw a young man running down the path from the neighbor's house to a car parked by the road. He was being chased by another man, but because of the trees by the road, the witness had a poor view of what was happening. He only saw the guy jump into the vehicle, then 2 shots rang out, and then the car sped off. Just a few minutes later, neighbors heard the howling of sirens and saw police cars and emergency vehicles starting to arrive at Rose's house, and soon an air ambulance helicopter landed on the lawn outside the house, arriving to pick up James, who was still alive. Everything that was happening resembled the shooting of some movie, and none of the eyewitnesses did not understand what happened. Arriving police officers were met by the elderly owner of the house, who was holding a firearm, and another gun belonging to him was later found in his bedroom. Curtis told his version of events, which was taken as the basis of the investigation and was long believed to be the only one. According to Curtis, there was nothing to portend trouble that day. In his and his wife's house visited his daughter with his son-in-law and grandchildren, as well as a neighbor's child who came to play. He himself was tinkering in his trailer in the backyard of the house. He heard the sounds of gunshots, but like most neighbors, he didn't pay much attention to it, thinking it was hunters in the woods. Suddenly, his oldest grandson, Seth, appeared at the trailer, arriving unannounced and looking very excited. The young man said there had been some kind of tragedy and asked him to call emergency services immediately. Curtis followed his grandson into the house, where he immediately came across the dead bodies of his wife and daughter. Curtis immediately thought of the children in the house. They were in the other room, frightened, but none of them were hurt. He took them to the back of the house and locked them up so they wouldn't see the horror that was going on in the house. While Curtis was calling emergency services, he saw his grandson hurriedly leaving the house and running toward the road. The homeowner drew his gun and began to chase Seth, believing that he was the killer. As Seth jumped into the car, Grandpa fired 2 shots. One bullet shattered the rear window without hitting the driver, and the second bullet hit Seth in the left shoulder. Despite the injury, he managed to get away, but after reaching the nearest house, Seth stopped to call the police and report what had happened. The local sheriff who was investigating was puzzled. The picture of the crime looked so strange and illogical that similar cases simply did not exist in his memory. In a breaking news report, he said that the investigators had a difficult job ahead of them to reconstruct the whole picture of the crime. After the arrest of Seth Denton, it was necessary to establish the motive why the young man had treated his family members so cruelly, and most surprisingly, such a motive was quickly found. Seth was the eldest child of his mother Toshi, whom she had given birth to in her early youth. Her relationship with the boy's father did not work out, and her son's upbringing was mostly handled by his grandparents, while the young woman settled her personal life. Also, according to some reports, Tosha suffered from bipolar affective disorder and periodically went to the clinic. Most likely, her son could also inherit this disease. Since childhood, the boy had a strong resentment towards his mother, whom he hardly ever saw. With age, this feeling turned into hatred, about which Seth often told friends and relatives. After graduating from school, the guy decided to go to serve in the army, and a year later, returning home, he again settled at his grandparents'. However, soon the young man decided that he wanted to start an independent life and moved to the city, where he rented a small apartment with his friend. He got a job at one of the local fast food restaurants, but shortly before the tragedy, the guy was fired. Family and friends spoke positively about Seth, noting that he never had any violent tendencies, did not run with bad companies, and never broke the law. But despite the positive characteristics, detectives considered that the main motive of the crime was Seth's unpleasant feelings towards his mother and her current spouse. According to the investigation, the events of that day developed as follows. Around 5 p.m., Seth drove his car to the house of his grandparents. He was wearing a camouflage jacket, and in the car lay a semi-automatic rifle. He left the car by the roadside, and with the weapon in hand, he went to the house, entering through the back door. Seth then fired several shots, killing his mother, grandmother, and severely wounding his stepfather, before leaving the jacket and rifle by the back door and going to his grandfather's house and asking him to call the police. The order in which the shots were fired was never determined because Seth completely denied his guilt. In addition, it was unclear why he asked his grandfather to call the police rather than fleeing immediately from the scene of the crime. It is assumed that his main target were his mother and stepfather, and the guy killed his grandmother as an unnecessary witness. As the main evidence proving Seth's guilt, the case included his jacket and rifle, found on the threshold at the back door of the house, traces of blood on his shoes, as well as bullets found in his car. Remarkably, about 100 rounds of ammunition in total were found, but no one questioned why he needed so many if he only planned to kill 2 people. Another oddity was the timing. According to the grandfather, after he and his grandson entered the house, where the terrible picture opened before his eyes, Seth hurriedly left the scene. Curtis himself found and took the children to safety, called the police, pulled out the gun he kept, and after all this, managed to catch up with his grandson and shot him twice. It was not until 2016 that the young man presented his version of what happened in court, which no one had previously considered for some reason. According to Seth, he has always been very close to his grandparents who raised him, but meetings with his mother he avoided by all means. As a teenager, he often went to shooting ranges with his grandfather, and it was his grandfather who encouraged him to join the army. On that fateful day, Seth called his maternal aunt Amanda, his mother's younger sister, and said he was going to visit his grandparents but didn't want to meet his mother there. The woman did not know that Tosha and her husband were visiting her parents, so she assured Seth that he could go without fear of crossing paths with his mother and stepfather. Amanda confirmed that information in court, noting that her nephew couldn't have known that Tosha and James were at Rose's house. Seth had hoped that he and his grandfather would go to the shooting range, and that was the reason he had brought a rifle with so many rounds of ammunition. He drove up to the house, got the gun, and went straight to the trailer where Grandpa usually worked. There, his grandson showed him his rifle, and they had a little discussion about it. Curtis then headed for the house without letting go of the rifle, and his grandson followed him. Seth knew that his grandfather had a gun and expected him to follow him, and afterward they would shoot targets together. However, when Curtis entered the room, he immediately opened fire, and the people in the room did not even have time to realize anything and did not try to run away or hide. According to Seth's lawyers, Curtis may have had a temporary insanity during which he killed members of his family. But this version seemed untenable, so it was not considered initially and marked in court. Although on the clothes and shoes of an elderly man also had traces of blood of the victims, he, for some reason from the very beginning, was not even included in the number of suspects. The young man in the dock was facing the capital punishment of death for the premeditated triple murder of his family members. His grandfather had been a key witness in the case from the beginning, and despite the fact that he had openly stated that he was prepared to kill his grandson that day, the court found such behavior justified. Curtis Rose was not taken to the station or questioned as a suspect, and his version of the events of that day was accepted as the only true one. In addition, many details and inconsistencies were simply overlooked, and Seth's version was not even considered until a year and a half after the crime. Most of the physical evidence did confirm Curtis's words, but what was out of the picture was somehow ignored by the investigation. The main argument in court was that Mr. Rose had no obvious motive for killing his wife, daughter, and son-in-law. The version of temporary insanity seemed far-fetched and untenable. The trial lasted more than a week, during which time nearly 200 pieces of evidence were presented and dozens of witnesses, including neighbors, relatives, and family friends, were heard. The grandfather and grandson's testimony completely contradicted each other, and it was obvious that one of them was lying. The jury deliberated for several days. They admitted to being severely exhausted emotionally and physically, but when it came to a verdict, they unanimously stated that they had no doubt that the defendant was guilty of each of the counts charged. Thus, Seth Denton was found guilty of triple murder, but after a detailed review of all the evidence and circumstances of the tragedy, the court decided to exclude the death penalty from the possible punishments, changing the sentence to life imprisonment without the right to parole, at least the next 50 years. The convict himself never admitted his guilt. He is currently serving his sentence in a Tennessee prison. As for the orphaned children of Tosha and James Milhorn, they were left in the care of other family members, including their Aunt Amanda and grandfather Curtis. The case of Kristen Rossum. She could have been a scientist, but she chose a different path. Blonde Kristen Rossum, a chemistry graduate from San Diego State University, could have had a brilliant future. Instead, she is serving a life sentence in the Central California Women's Facility for the crime against her husband. Ralph and Constance Rossum had 3 children and were preparing them for an undoubtedly bright future. The children received education from top schools, were tutored, and participated in clubs and sections for talent development. However, the fragile and impulsive Kristen broke, unable to keep up with the pace and pursuit of the ideal. Lying, skipping classes, and the desire to escape reality first introduced her to a sense of ease and oblivion after consuming alcohol. But soon, alcohol stopped providing the desired effect of tranquility, and she became dependent on the controlled substance methamphetamine. Methamphetamine, meth, is the most addictive illicit substance in the USA. It causes paranoia, clouds judgment, euphoria, and hallucinations. Kristen's erratic behavior and detachment from real life caught her parents' attention. After a long conversation, she admitted that she had been addicted to the substance since high school. This behavior was a severe blow for a family of university-educated professionals. After several months of numerous conflicts with her parents, 17-year-old Kristen secretly ran away to Mexico with friends for a holiday. There, she met a man by chance. Tall, handsome Gregory de Villiers, 7 years her senior, seemed like an angel who would save her. And he did. Greg fell in love with the bad girl. He took on the role of a parent and responsibility for her well-being. With Greg's support, she managed to get a job at a local forensic department as a toxicology assistant. Her skills impressed the employer. Her addiction was forgotten, which worked in her favor, as her job in toxicology provided access to seized controlled substances. As a forensic assistant, Kristen graduated from university with honors. Her teachers and employer praised her, handing her the Best Student Award, unaware of the reasons for her love of the chosen profession. Her relationship with Greg lasted about 5 years and ended with a grand wedding on June 5, 1999. Kristen's parents adored Greg and were at ease for their daughter, as she had climbed out of the pit of dependency and confidently stood on the road to a promising and happy life. In March 2000, Kristen was hired by the San Diego County Medical Examiner's Office as a toxicologist. A toxicologist analyzes body fluids to detect controlled substances. Gregory was working in the biotechnology industry at the time. Kristen quickly grew bored with her monotonous life and began seeking excitement elsewhere. She found an opportunity with a new colleague, Michael Robertson, who had been appointed as the department head. He was married, but that didn't stop a sudden infatuation between them. They couldn't keep their relationship secret for long. Greg found numerous letters exchanged between the secret lovers. The marital relationship deteriorated, but Gregory still hoped to save the marriage, knowing his wife's weaknesses and trying as hard as ever to save her. This time, Kristen didn't want to be saved. She demanded a divorce. On the morning of Monday, November 6, 2000, Kristen was getting ready for work as usual. Greg was ill and stayed home. Kristen was very worried about her husband. In the days following their separation talk, he had been lethargic and unusually calm. She informed his workplace of her husband's illness. She also visited him during her lunch break. Greg was asleep. At 9:22 p.m. that same day, Christine called emergency services to report that her husband, Greg, was not breathing. He had most likely committed suicide because he was home alone. The woman cried into the phone and did not listen to the dispatcher's instructions to examine the body and possibly administer first aid. Police officers and paramedics arriving on the scene at 10:19 p.m. pronounced Gregory de Villiers dead. He was lying on the bedroom floor with his torso exposed, surrounded by scattered rose petals. The room examination suggested that Greg most likely consumed a lethal dose of several controlled substances. Empty vials of powerful painkillers were scattered around, and torn wedding photos were found on his bed. During the interrogation, Kristen stated that she had informed her husband of their separation the previous evening. Just 17 months after the wedding, she regretted getting married. She felt she had rushed into it. Greg was too clingy, and she wanted to distance herself. Greg's death was ruled a suicide. The cause of death was strong sedative drugs. Kristen signed the cremation papers. However, Gregory's family and friends refused to believe in such a sudden suicide. None of them noticed any changes in his character or mood. He had not shared his marital problems with anyone. Greg was so opposed to controlled substances that he would never have taken them. Soon, the relatives managed to stop the cremation and insisted on an independent autopsy. The family's persistence allowed for the consideration of a homicide scenario. Soon, toxicological tests revealed that Gregory's body contained an extremely high amount of fentanyl, a pain reliever 150 times stronger than morphine, along with lesser amounts of clonazepam and trace amounts of oxycodone, known as hillbilly heroin. Investigators speculated that, under the strong influence of clonazepam and other detected drugs, someone else administered the lethal dose of fentanyl to Gregory. Kristen became the prime suspect, as fentanyl is not an over-the-counter medication, and she had ample knowledge and access to such drugs. Upon arrival for interrogation at the police station, Kristen's emaciated, unattractive appearance and her doping behavior indicated her drug dependency. This was confirmed by her own statements on the day of Gregory's death. Kristen was inconsistent in her accounts. Initially, Kristen told paramedics that Gregory had not taken any medication, but later she changed her statement, suggesting he might have taken oxycodone. At the hospital, Kristen told a nurse that Gregory might have overdosed on oxycodone. Oxycodone is similar in effect to codeine-based drugs. It can not only relieve pain, but also induce a sense of euphoria. It depresses the respiratory center, and without timely assistance, its use can be fatal. The police considered the possibility that Gregory died from an accidental overdose of cold medicine and oxycodone. In conversations with Kristen, they also learned that Gregory was very upset about their failing marriage, leading Kristen to tell the police that he ended his own life. This was another investigative avenue they explored. On November 8th, a colleague of Kristen's, Russ Lowe, called the police. He informed them about Kristen's affair with her boss. This information shifted the course of the police investigation. Evidence of Kristen's connection with her boss, Dr. Robertson, was found. The evidence included passionate emails they exchanged, as well as computer files and professional articles revealing Dr. Robertson's specialized knowledge of fentanyl. The criminal puzzle was coming together perfectly. It was suspected that Gregory became a threat to the lovers, as he knew that Kristen, with her access to the lab and controlled substances, was secretly using them, and Michael was covering for her. It was a premeditated crime. The challenge for the investigators was to prove it. During interrogation, Michael Robertson told detectives that he was aware of his lover's drug dependency. At that time, no charges were brought against the couple. They were both dismissed from their jobs for violating several rules during the investigation. Serious trouble for Kristen began in January when police raided her home, finding traces of drugs and paraphernalia. She was arrested for the first time but was later released on bail. The investigation progressed as new information emerged. This included Kristen's diary. During its initial examination, investigators hypothesized that it was written by Kristen not for herself, but for an external reader, as a means of covering up and affirming her innocence while crafting the appearance of Gregory's perfect self-inflicted demise. On the day of her husband's death, she bought a rose in revealing lingerie actions inconsistent with her distressed demeanor. Medical examination indicated that Gregory was unconscious for at least 6 hours before his passing, and his death could have occurred an hour or an hour and a half before it was confirmed. Additionally, a bruise around a needle injection site on the young man's arm was found, its purpose and executor unexplained. At Kristen's workplace, a shortage of the drug that led to Gregory's demise, as well as other controlled substances, was discovered. Police believed Kristen poisoned Gregory, administering fentanyl without his knowledge. The prosecution built its case on toxicological and medical data. With enough circumstantial evidence, Christine was arrested on June 25, 2001, and charged with first-degree murder. After spending 6 months in custody, she was released on bail. The first trial soon commenced. The prosecution's main theory was the motive for the homicide. They argued that she terminated Gregory because he threatened to tarnish her good girl reputation by revealing her renewed drug use and affair with Michael Robertson. The prosecution claimed Kristen poisoned Gregory with fentanyl. The court heard that fentanyl is a powerful synthetic opioid, 80 times stronger than morphine. It was suggested that she first tried to end his life with clonazepam, but when that failed, she administered fentanyl. They also argued that she then staged the bedroom to look like Gregory ended his own life, tearing pages from her diary and placing rose petals and a wedding photo around his body. The court heard that Kristen, with a degree in biochemistry, used her knowledge of drugs and chemistry to terminate Gregory. The prosecution also claimed that Kristen hoped to convince her colleagues in the medical examiner's office that Gregory's death was self-inflicted, hiding information about the fentanyl. However, before Gregory's autopsy could be conducted, she was transferred to another lab, and the attempt to substitute toxicological research was unsuccessful. The prosecution presented Kristen's day on November 6th. Early in the morning, she called Gregory's employer to report his absence, then went to work. Her colleagues testified that about an hour after she arrived at work, around 9 a.m., she was seen crying in Michael's office. The apartment building manager, where Kristen and Gregory lived, reported seeing her return home at 12:10 p.m. At 12:41 p.m., she went to a local grocery store and purchased several items, including a single red rose. Credit card statements confirm this fact. Hours before Gregory's demise, she made multiple calls to Michael. Dr. Brian Blackburn, the San Diego County medical examiner who conducted Gregory's autopsy, testified that Gregory had been deceased for at least an hour before the paramedics arrived. He informed the court that Gregory developed early bronchopneumonia This condition arises when secretions, normally expelled through breathing, accumulate in the lungs because a person is either unconscious or not breathing deeply enough. Dr. Blackburn also informed the court that Gregory's bladder contained a significant amount of urine, which would have been very uncomfortable had he been conscious. This led Dr. Blackburn to conclude that Gregory was breathing poorly for approximately 6 to 12 hours before his death. A person in an unconscious state would not be able to sprinkle rose petals over themselves. Dr. Blackburn showed that the level of clonazepam found in Gregory's blood was not at an overdose level and was not lethal. Dr. Theodore Stanley testified on behalf of the prosecution. He demonstrated that fentanyl is a potent and fast-acting pain reliever with a serious side effect that can lead to a person's respiratory arrest. Dr. Stanley stated that the speed at which fentanyl begins to act depends on the method of its administration. The peak effect occurs about 16 hours after applying a transdermal patch, 20 to 30 minutes after oral ingestion, 15 to 20 minutes after intramuscular injection, and within 5 minutes after intravenous injection. Dr. Stanley informed the court that fentanyl is usually not administered orally because the liver destroys about 65% of it, so only 35% enters the bloodstream. When asked to explain how fentanyl entered Gregory's system, neither Dr. Blackburn nor Dr. Stanley could provide a definitive opinion. Dr. Stanley showed that various concentration levels in Gregory's body, along with data indicating that Gregory was unconscious and breathing shallowly for several hours before his death, suggest that fentanyl was likely administered to Gregory multiple times. The prosecution could not confidently tell the jury how Kristen poisoned Gregory, but there were indications that she might have applied fentanyl patches to his arm while he was asleep. The disappearance of 15 patches from the laboratory where Kristen formerly worked supported this theory as a possibility. The defense asserted Kristen's innocence, acknowledging that fentanyl was the cause of Gregory's death, but claimed he self-administered it, intentionally causing his own demise due to despair over family issues. Kristen testified in court, describing waking up on the morning of November 6th to find Gregory distraught. She called his employer at 7:42 a.m. to report his illness and that he wouldn't be coming to work. She told the court she went to work but returned to the apartment to check on Gregory, having lunch with him after noon. Christine's testimony. I asked Gregory why he was so upset that morning. He replied that he wasn't feeling well and had taken some oxycodone and clonazepam. He planned to stay home and sleep. I left for work. Around 2:30 in the afternoon during my lunch break, I came home to check on Gregory. We had lunch. I then went back to work. I got home around 8 o'clock in the evening. Gregory was lying on the bed. I thought he was asleep. I took a bath. When I came out, I tried to wake him up. He was cold. I called the emergency services. The prosecutor cross-examined Kristen, calling her explanation strange. She admitted to lying in the past and about her drug use. He told the court that fentanyl was the perfect poison because it's hard to detect, which she knew well from her job. Medical testimony, based on autopsy and toxicological findings, proved that Gregory was unconscious for about 8 hours, meaning Kristen couldn't have had lunch with her husband that day. The defense claimed that although Dr. Blackburn showed the clonazepam level in Gregory's blood wasn't lethal, taking oxycodone, an opioid, and clonazepam, a benzodiazepine, together could create a synergistic effect, making them more potent. They suggested Gregory might have unknowingly taken the drugs himself. How fentanyl was administered and why high levels were found in his system remained unexplained. After 8 hours of deliberation, the jury found Kristen guilty of first-degree homicide and special circumstances homicide due to the use of poison. She was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. Kristen maintained her innocence and appealed the verdict. The appellate court heard that errors were made by her own defense team. Her lawyers admitted fentanyl caused the death but failed to test autopsy samples for fentanyl metabolites. This test could have determined whether Gregory swallowed fentanyl or if the fentanyl found in the samples was a result of laboratory contamination after his death. If fentanyl had been detected only in the samples and never in Gregory's body, the prosecution's theory that fentanyl caused his death would have been incorrect. The appellate court heard that there was a break in the chain of custody regarding the samples. They were placed in a cardboard box, with each container marked as a sample from Gregory's body, but the containers weren't sealed. They were supposed to be delivered to the sheriff's office for immediate transfer to an external lab, but the person supposed to receive the samples was absent, so the box remained at the medical examiner's office for about 36 hours before being delivered to the sheriff's forensic lab. The appellate court's argument was that anyone with a key to the medical examiner's office building had access to the samples. Fentanyl could have been added to the samples posthumously. Kristen believed there was a motive to tamper with the samples and frame her for the crime due to various personal relationships and tensions among the staff. Indeed, Kristen argued in the appellate court that on November 8, 2000, Michael informed one of the toxicologists that he had examined a sample of Gregory's stomach contents. The three-judge panel of the 9th U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals concluded that Kristen's lawyers erred in not contesting the prosecution's claim that her husband died from a fentanyl overdose. They stated that her legal team should have tested the autopsy samples for fentanyl metabolites, rather than just admitting he died in such a manner. However, they did not overturn the verdict, but sent the case back to federal court to determine if this defense error could have altered the trial's outcome. After this decision, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that federal courts must adhere to the state court's decision when considering such appeals. Based on this ruling, the appellate court voted against holding a hearing on Kristen's case. Her appeal was denied, and she remains in custody. Michael Robertson was implicated as an accomplice in Kristen's trial. Authorities discreetly filed a criminal conspiracy complaint and issued a sealed warrant for the arrest of Michael Robertson, the former boss and lover of convicted perpetrator Kristen Rossum. Robertson, who lives freely and works as a forensic toxicology consultant in Australia since Rossum's husband's demise in 2000, could be arrested and held on $100,000 bail if he ever returns to the United States. Gregory's family filed a lawsuit accusing the county of negligence that allowed Kristen to steal a lethal dose of drugs from the medical examiner's office undetected. In 2006, a U.S. court awarded them $147 million in civil damages. In a case that continues to captivate the nation, Rossum, a former toxicologist at the county medical examiner's office, was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole in February 2003 for stealing drugs from the lab and using them to poison her husband, Gregory de Villers, staging a suicide scene in their apartment, scattering his body with red rose petals. Greed, envy, and the desire to get wealth without much effort often push people to commit the most heinous and cynical crimes. Sometimes it is hard to imagine what cruelty a person is capable of for the sake of quick enrichment, for example, the murder of a close relative. The story of Elizabeth Vasquez is truly shocking and horrifying. This kind and hard-working woman all her life worked for the good of her family, striving to give her beloved daughter all the best, including a good education. But the greedy heiress, along with her boyfriend, did the unthinkable. This complex case for several years stirred the press and shocked the public with its inhumanity, showing how a young woman can easily decide to kill her own mother. Let's try to understand how in a prosperous and well-to-do family grew a real monster, devoid of any feelings of pity, remorse, or conscience. The large and happy Vasquez family. In 1967, in the town of Cajamarca in northwestern Peru, a girl named Elizabeth Lillian Vasquez Movilla was born. She was the oldest of 6 children in the family of Ernesto Vasquez and Maria Movilla. Her parents were hard-working, simple people who worked hard to provide for their many offspring, give them an education and a chance at a better life. The Vasquez family was friendly and very happy, and from an early age, Elizabeth helped her mother take care of her younger siblings. She was an excellent student and graduated from school with honors, which allowed her to easily enter the prestigious university at the Faculty of Law and Economics. While at the university, she met a young man named Alejandro Mendez Espino, who was also studying law and was known as one of the top students in his class. A romantic relationship quickly developed between the two, which grew rapidly, and they were officially married in 1987, even before graduating from university. Elizabeth's parents approved of her choice from the very beginning and gladly accepted her son-in-law into the family. Alejandro was a serious, intelligent, ambitious, and very purposeful man who could take good care of their eldest daughter. At first, the newlyweds lived in the Vasquez family home, but after 6 months, when Elizabeth became pregnant, they decided to move into their separate home. Only daughter. Approximately a year after their marriage in 1988, the couple welcomed their only joint heir, whom they named after the mother, Elizabeth Vasquez Espino. Affectionately called Elita in the family, the girl became the center of attention for all her numerous relatives and the main joy of her parents. Several years after the birth of their daughter, the couple, whose careers were steadily ascending, decided to move to Peru's capital, Lima. By then, Alejandro was vying for a prosecutor position in an anti-corruption department, while Elizabeth had opened her own legal consulting firm. Both worked tirelessly for the benefit of their family, but unfortunately couldn't spend enough time with their young daughter. Confronted with an unsatisfactory experience hiring a nanny who didn't fulfill her duties conscientiously, the young mother decided to send her daughter to her parents in Cajamarca for them to take care of the heiress. Maria and Ernesto readily agreed and were overjoyed to have their granddaughter live with them for a while. Notably, their youngest daughter, Giovanna, Elita's aunt, was only a couple of years older than Elita, so they immediately got along and interacted like real sisters. Due to their total commitment to work, the parents rarely saw their daughter and compensated by showering her with gifts during visits. Elita's stay at her grandparents' home stretched over several years, and when her parents decided to bring her back to their home in Lima, she had already started school. It's worth noting that the abrupt change in environment did not benefit the girl, and she took quite some time to adapt to life in the bustling, noisy capital after the quiet, almost provincial Cajamarca. The challenging parent-daughter relationship. As a child, Elita was a quiet and well-behaved kid. She strove to excel academically, engaging in music and foreign languages. She shared a warm and trusting relationship with her parents, who tried to compensate for the years of enforced separation. Elizabeth aimed to be not just a mother, but also Elita's best friend, someone she could share her deepest thoughts with. This remained true until Elita turned 15. During her teenage years, Elita's character deteriorated rapidly. She became rude, threw tantrums, and stopped listening to her parents. She abandoned her studies, got involved with bad company, and worst of all, began stealing money from her parents' wallets. Elizabeth tried various approaches to connect with her daughter, hoping it was just a phase that Elita would outgrow. However, the girl regularly instigated heated arguments with her mother, ending in hysterics and tears. During these moments, Alejandro typically remained neutral, but if Elita sought his intervention, he often took her side. Elita was deeply hurt and offended by being constantly compared to her smart, beautiful, successful, and hard-working mother. Next to Elizabeth, Elita indeed appeared as the ugly duckling, being the complete opposite of her mother in every aspect. She lacked striking looks, was overweight, lazy, and temperamental, often lied, and didn't shy away from theft. Elita harbored numerous complexes about her appearance. When she expressed a desire for plastic surgery, Elizabeth, eager to please her daughter and mend their relationship, didn't dissuade her. Elizabeth financed an initial rhinoplasty for her daughter, and a few years later, several more surgeries. In 2007, after 20 years of marriage, Alejandro and Elizabeth decided to separate. Their 18-year-old daughter reacted with a hysterical outburst, screaming, insulting, and blaming her mother for driving her father away. At the time, the family was in the United States, and the divorce posed some complications for citizens of another country. Nonetheless, they returned home as divorced individuals and began living separately. By mutual agreement, the now adult but still dependent daughter stayed in her mother's house. They continued to have fierce arguments, and during such moments, Elita would call her father, crying and begging him to take her in. However, Alejandro, who had moved on with a new love, was not eager to do so. He always convinced Elita to reconcile with her mother and wait a bit longer until she finished university and started an independent life. Despite her plummeting academic performance, terrible character, and provocative behavior, Elita's parents ensured she enrolled in the law faculty of one of Peru's most prestigious universities. The education was costly, but her father and mother decided not to skimp on the education of their only child. Elita's unreliable boyfriend Elita had her fair share of teenage romances, but at 19, she fell genuinely in love for the first time. It all started one Sunday morning at church, where she met a charming young man named Fernando Gonzalez. He couldn't take his eyes off her during the service, and afterward, he approached her to introduce himself. To Elita, Fernando seemed like a prince, handsome, attentive, with a pleasant voice. He invited her for coffee and a chat. As it turned out, he had a habit of scouting churches for young, well-dressed girls who arrived in luxury cars, then would strike up a conversation, charm them, and play on their sympathies. He'd spin tales about his difficult childhood in a large family abandoned by their father, how he was now supporting his mother, brothers and sisters by working multiple jobs. Wealthy and naive girls would sympathize and give him money. Sometimes he managed to maintain a wealthy girlfriend for a few months, but typically, they'd leave him once the truth was revealed. He was just an unemployed slacker who loved the high life. Elita fell easily into Fernando's trap due to her complexes. Always considering herself unattractive, she couldn't believe such a handsome man noticed her and was ready to give him everything she had, or rather, everything her mother had. She opened up to her mother about everything, leading to their first candid conversation in years. Elizabeth thought she had a chance to mend their relationship, especially since Elita had met the boy in church, which seemed promising, and assumed he must be a good person. Upon their first meeting, Fernando managed to make a positive impression on Elizabeth. He told her his dramatic life story, and she believed him, deciding that such a good boy deserved help. She rented a cozy apartment for him near central Lima, agreeing to pay 70% of the monthly rent. She also paid for his business school tuition, promising him a job in her company later on. It seemed that Fernando gratefully accepted her generosity, ready to start studying. However, he had no interest in attending boring lectures or working. He just wanted to have fun and spend someone else's money. He gladly moved into the rented apartment but never paid anything towards it, claiming to be broke and promising to pay back later. Soon it became clear that Fernando only attended a couple of business school classes before quitting. After a serious talk with Elizabeth, he seemed remorseful. She decided to give him a second chance and employed him as a courier in her company. On his very first day, he not only failed to complete a simple task, but also betrayed other employees who had entrusted him with important documents. Elizabeth finally realized that this young man had charmed her daughter only to leech off her for his own needs. He had no intentions of studying or working. She then forbade Elita from seeing him, which provoked her daughter's anger and resentment. Elita screamed and cried, accusing her mother of trying to ruin her life and take away her happiness. She refused to listen to reason and insisted she would continue seeing Fernando. Failed attempt to separate the couple. Elizabeth decided to send her daughter to her parents' home for a while, naively believing that if Elita didn't see her boyfriend for a few months, her feelings would cool down, and Fernando would find another rich fool to exploit. But Elizabeth was greatly mistaken. Elita continued to communicate with her boyfriend through calls and social media, and her resentment towards her mother only grew. Fernando had to move out of the rental apartment after Elizabeth refused to pay for it. However, he found a smaller place, rented for him by his young lover with her mother's money. Elita had some financial freedom, being a spoiled child, and could freely use some of her mother's accounts. When the summer break ended and university resumed, Elita immediately rushed to meet her boyfriend, who once again asked her for money. She withdrew a substantial amount from her mother's account and gave it to him, leading to a serious confrontation with her mother later that evening upon noticing the missing funds. Elizabeth then decided to block Elita's access to her accounts, giving her only a small weekly allowance for personal expenses. This decision further strained their already tense relationship. They barely spoke, mainly engaged in arguments, and Elizabeth's attempts to reach out to her daughter were unsuccessful. The monstrous plan. During one of their romantic dates, when Elita couldn't bring Fernando the money he demanded, he became furiously angry. He cursed Elizabeth, screaming that she had plenty of money but wouldn't give any to her only daughter, then added that if Elizabeth were gone, adult Elita would inherit all her wealth, and they could live luxuriously. This terrible idea took root in Elita's mind, growing stronger each day. She constantly talked about how much she hated her mother, blamed her for all her misfortunes, and fantasized about how wonderful it would be if her mother disappeared. The young lovers began to devise a monstrous and cynical plan to eliminate Vasquez, also considering whom they could involve as accomplices. At that time, Elizabeth had nearly $3 million in her accounts, owned a successful business that could be sold, a large house in an elite area of the capital, several cars, and her life was insured for a significant amount. In the event of her death, all of this would be inherited by her only child, Elita. Elizabeth seemed to sense danger. She realized she couldn't separate her daughter from the mercenary and deceitful young man who negatively influenced her. The situation was escalating and could resolve in the most unpredictable way. Being an experienced lawyer, Elizabeth drafted a will stating that in case of her sudden disappearance or untimely death, all money and property should go to Ernesto Vasquez, her father. She even managed to visit her parents and tell them about her decision. Meanwhile, Elita planned to stage the kidnapping and murder of her own mother by suspected criminals who would never be found. She and Fernando decided to involve a tough guy, Jorge Carnejo Ruiz, promising to pay him generously for his services. He accepted the offer without a second thought. A crime against his own mother. On January 24, 2010, 21-year-old Elita met with her 23-year-old boyfriend to finalize the plan for the crime that was to take place the next day. She was calm and collected, already envisioning how she would spend the millions she had inherited. The next morning, January 25th, citing ill health, Elita did not go to the university and stayed home. When her mother left for work, Fernando and Jorge were already lurking outside the house, waiting for Elita to distract the guard and sneak them inside. Elita approached the guard on duty and asked him to buy painkillers from the nearest pharmacy, which was only a 5-minute walk away. This brief absence allowed the young men to sneak into the house and hide in the master bedroom. When Elizabeth returned, Elita loudly dropped a glass in the kitchen, signaling her attackers to gather. When Elizabeth entered her room, Fernando knocked her to the ground and began choking her, with Jorge holding her down. Miraculously, Elizabeth managed to break free and run out into the hallway, where her own daughter kicked her in the head. While Elizabeth was unconscious, they tied her up. However, their plans were disrupted by a young servant girl, Maria Celine, whom Elita tricked into another room and locked her in. When Elizabeth regained consciousness, her daughter, boyfriend, and their accomplice brutally tortured her, trying to find out the code to the safe and passwords to her bank accounts. Terrified, Elizabeth knew her daughter was in trouble, but had always blamed it on Gonzalez's bad influence. Now, however, she saw the monstrous nature of her only daughter. Elizabeth managed to loosen the restraints and fought back against her daughter, scratching and punching her until Fernando knocked her to the ground. An enraged Elita kicked her mother and finally, in a fit of rage, grabbed a pillow and smothered her until she stopped showing signs of life. The trio then bound the lifeless body, duct taped her mouth shut, and placed Elizabeth in the trunk of her own car, staging a kidnapping. Elita then sent another guard to get medication, allowing her accomplices to drive off the property. She later freed a terrified Maria, falsely claiming that she and her mother had quarreled but made up, and that her mother had gone to bed. A strange story of a kidnapping and the search for a missing woman. In the morning, the maid was preparing breakfast as usual, but Elita came to the kitchen and told her that her mother had gone to work early because of an important meeting. After that, Elita left the house to go to her mother's workplace. There, she walked into the office of Jessica Hippo, her mother's best friend and accountant, and tearfully reported that her mother was missing and that she was receiving strange, threatening, and ransom calls. The accountant immediately started blocking the accounts to prevent the intruders from accessing them, reported the incident to the police, and left the office for a while. When she returned, Elita was gone and the office was in disarray, as if someone was looking for something. Later, it turned out that Elizabeth's will was missing, which Elita had learned about the day before by overhearing a telephone conversation. Using a key she had stolen from her mother, Elita had also taken a copy of the will and cash from the safe in her mother's study. Police arrived and inspected the house, interviewing the missing woman's daughter as well as the office staff, but gained no valuable information. All claimed that Vasquez had no enemies and no one had threatened her, so no one was initially listed as a suspect. The main theory was that it was a kidnapping for ransom. All that was left was to wait for a call from the criminals to receive further instructions and demands. A terrifying discovery and the first suspect. The day after Elizabeth's disappearance became known, it was reported that her car was found abandoned in a vacant lot outside of town. The interior was empty, but when law enforcement officers opened the trunk, they were shocked by what they found. Inside lay the lifeless body of a missing woman with signs of beatings. Forensic experts counted dozens of bruises, severe head trauma, and rope marks on the victim's body, indicating that the woman had been tied up and tried to free herself. It was also determined that Vasquez's death was caused by asphyxiation. Particles of blood and epithelium were found under her fingernails, indicating that she had resisted. It was now necessary to determine who the blood belonged to. At the lineup, Alita appeared as a grief-stricken daughter. She cried, wailed, and seemed almost unconscious. However, at the interrogation, she behaved quite differently. She was calm, even cold-blooded, and the questions of the investigators, she was visibly annoyed. In addition, she constantly contradicted herself in her testimony. When the police decided to check the information about the calls from the kidnappers and sent a request to the cell phone company, it turned out that Alita did not receive any calls. It also turned out that in the days before and after her mother's disappearance, Alita had been in frequent contact with one Fernando Gonzalez, who they also decided to question. However, the young man either insisted on his innocence or remained silent. Irrefutable evidence and an arrest. Elizabeth's maternal grandparents were in charge of her funeral, while Elizabeth herself was indifferent, thinking only about how to get out of the situation, stay free, and save money. She called her father, who was already aware of what had happened, and crying, told him of her innocence and asked for help. Her father advised her not to talk too much and promised to get her out of the situation, even though he knew perfectly well who had committed the crime. However, he did not want his daughter to go to prison because it would have cast a shadow of shame on Alejandro, who at the time held the high office of Justice of the Peace and President of the Supreme Court, and was a powerful and respected man. Meanwhile, forensic results showed that the blood and skin particles under the deceased's fingernails belonged to her daughter. Alita tried to claim that she had a serious quarrel with her mother, and they briefly quarreled, but then made up. However, no one believed her anymore. Further inspection of Elizabeth's room with special equipment revealed numerous wiped traces of blood throughout the house, including in Alita's room, despite her attempts to wipe away the evidence. Alita's story that she had an argument with her mother in the evening, but then made up, and the claim that her mother left early for work the next morning and was never seen again, quickly fell apart. She contradicted herself, first saying she had not gone into her mother's room, and then remembering that she had. The ransom calls were completely fabricated by her. The testimony of the maid Maria Chalain played a decisive role in the case. She told how on the night of the crime, Alita locked her in a room from where she heard Elizabeth's screams and sounds of struggle, but could not help. After that night, she never saw her employer again, and Alita insisted that everything was fine with her mother, who had simply gone to work early. All of this led to the arrest of Alita and her boyfriend, the criminal trio, and the battle for the inheritance. Alita was arrested at her mother's house. Her boyfriend was detained a few hours later at an entertainment establishment, and the next morning, Jorge was arrested, betrayed by Fernando, who tried to blame the crime on him. It is noteworthy that it was Gonzalez who first began to testify, hoping that cooperation with the investigation will benefit him and help to mitigate the sentence. Meanwhile, Alejandro hired the best lawyers for his daughter, but realized that she will not be able to escape punishment. At the same time, he began to deal with Vasquez's inheritance, intending to take it for himself. Since the will had disappeared and the heiress was facing a long prison sentence, he claimed that he and Elizabeth had never divorced but simply lived apart, remaining legally married. Meanwhile, Ernesto Vasquez, Alita's grandfather, decided to visit his favorite granddaughter in prison to look her in the eye. as he could not believe that the girl he had known and raised since infancy could commit such a horrible act. However, Alita behaved arrogantly, shouted, insulted the older man, and stated that she did not wish to see him again. This encounter upset him greatly, leading to a heart attack from which he was unable to recover and died 6 months later. The Vasquez family was unable to prove the existence of the will left in Ernesto's name, as the document disappeared from Elizabeth's office and the notary's database, seemingly taken care of by Alejandro. All documents and references to the couple's divorce also mysteriously disappeared, giving Alejandro the right to claim the deceased's inheritance. The trial and the verdict. Despite attempts by Alita, Fernando, and Jorge to shift the blame onto each other, the investigation successfully reconstructed the events of that fateful evening and established the role of each participant in the crime. It was also proven that the trio acted in a deliberate conspiracy, which greatly aggravated their guilt. A decisive role in the trial was played by the testimony of the maid Maria, who stated that Alejandro had threatened her, demanding that she give a different version of events, but she refused to comply. In May 2012, the court found all 3 defendants guilty. Initially, the prosecutor had requested that each participant in the murder be sentenced to 30 years imprisonment. While the men pleaded guilty, Alita continually played the victim. Fernando and Jorge were eventually sentenced to 28 years each, but Alita's trial was delayed. Alita claimed that the perpetrators were hired by relatives on her mother's side, who fabricated the inheritance story in order to take possession of Elizabeth's property and money. Her father held the same version of events. Attempts to declare Alita mentally ill and susceptible to manipulation by criminals also failed. This strategy, proposed by Alejandro, was to send her to a psychiatric hospital instead of prison, declaring her insane and incapable of fully and solely inheriting his wife's estate. Finally, in December 2012, the court delivered its final verdict, sentencing Alita to the maximum term of 30 years in prison. To this day, she and her accomplices are serving their sentences in prison. As for the disputed inheritance, its fate remains unresolved. In the spring of 2021, Alejandro died without becoming the only heir. The Vasquez family, through the court, seeks to exclude Alita from the list of claimants to Elizabeth's property, citing the fact that she is in prison for murder. Currently, the main claimant for the inheritance is Maria Movila, Elizabeth's mother. Today, we'll be exploring one of the most southern states in America, Mississippi. This state is rich in amazing places, such as the Vicksburg National Military Park, a Civil War battle site, Biloxi Beach, a perfect spot for coastal relaxation. Animal lovers will definitely appreciate the Marine Mammal Studies Institute. History and architecture enthusiasts will be captivated by the town of Melrose, which boasts many stunningly beautiful homes. And undoubtedly, the Biloxi Lighthouse is an excellent place for photography. But the brightest star of the state is, of course, the renowned University of Mississippi, commonly known as Ole Miss, where our story unfolds. During the summer, when academic activities on the university campus come to an end, it becomes especially quiet. The few students who remain over the summer attend extra lectures during the day or prepare on their own for the next academic year, and in the evening, they invariably visit local bars and nightclubs. Among these students was Ellie Kostiel. She was an upperclassman and stayed on campus over the summer to improve her knowledge in certain subjects. Recently, she passed an important exam for her class, Introduction to Retail, at summer school, and was planning to celebrate this with her friends. A small bar with pizza and daiquiris on Oxford Square is particularly popular among the youth, so it's always filled with people and resembles an eternal party. The dim light, loud music, and a rainbow selection of various drinks make it a place where bartenders know many of the customers by name. On the evening of July 19th, Ellie Kostiel met up with friends at this bar. They talked and had fun, but Ellie seemed tense and spent the whole evening messaging someone on her phone. Then she had a couple of cocktails and discreetly left. This was one of the last places where Ole Miss student Ellie Kostiel was seen in public. On July 20th, 2019, around 10:30 a.m. during their routine patrol, police officers discovered the body of a young woman. It was found near an abandoned fishing camp by Sardis Lake, approximately 30 miles from the university. At the scene, the victim was found with 9 gunshot wounds to her back. Investigators collected 11 shell casings at the scene. A purse containing a driver's license and a student ID belonging to 21-year-old Alexandria Costiel, a University of Mississippi student, was found nearby on the roadside. Alexandria Costiel, affectionately known by friends and family as Ellie, was born on September 11, 1997, in St. Louis, Missouri. A blonde-haired little girl, she grew up surrounded by the care and love of her mother, Cindy, and father, Keith. Her parents supported all her endeavors in learning new things. Ellie excelled academically and in sports, participating in track and field and golf. She loved adventures and traveling, but her dream was to attend the University of Mississippi. This special place, with its traditions and new student life, was her dream destination. Her dream came true, and she became a student at the legendary Ole Miss. Ellie lived in a dormitory in Oxford, Mississippi, and was popular among her peers. Friends and relatives praised Ellie, describing her as a lively and energetic person who greeted everyone with a smile. The tragic loss was a shock to the close-knit community of the lovely girl and her fellow students at the University of Mississippi, as investigators worked tirelessly to uncover the facts. Ellie's father confirmed the tragic news of her death in a Facebook post on Sunday. Yesterday, on Saturday afternoon, the Sunset Hills, Missouri, police visited us and informed us that our beautiful dear Alexandria, our sweet Ellie, was the victim of a crime, wrote Keith Costiel. She was attending summer school and taught fitness at the University of Mississippi in Oxford, Mississippi. She graduated from Lindbergh High School in 2016. She was just 21 years old. "We are deeply saddened," said Interim Chancellor of the University of Mississippi Larry Sparks in a statement to Today. "Ellie was a valued member of our student community." Lafayette County investigator Jarrett Bundren told CBS on Saturday morning, "A white female was found on the ground with multiple gunshot wounds to her back. I'm working on this case and it's heartbreaking, the girl who was shot so many times." According to sources, a local resident walking their dog reported hearing gunshots early in the morning between approximately 2:15 and 2:30 a.m. Initiating an investigation, police immediately gained access to the rented apartment where Ellie Costiel lived. Although the victim's phone was missing, her Apple Watch was discovered in the room. Witness interviews revealed that a few days before the incident, Ellie's parents had visited her from St. Louis, and she had shared with them how eagerly she was looking forward to the start of the new academic year at the university and had no regrets about staying on campus for the summer. Data from the Apple Watch also showed that after a phone conversation with her mother, the young woman sent several messages to someone named Brandon Theisfeld. Upon examining the messages, detectives learned that 3 months prior to the incident, Ellie had shared shocking news with Brandon. Since Brandon was the last person known to have communicated with the victim, he became a subject of interest to the police. Further examination of their messages revealed that Ellie and Brandon had been in an on-and-off romantic relationship. Brandon Theisfeld, a tall, dark-haired young man with an athletic build, was also a student at the University of Mississippi. He hailed from Fort Worth, Texas, and was raised in a well-mannered family. In 2016, as a freshman, Ellie met Brandon and immediately fell for him. The young people started dating, but they never officially declared themselves as a couple. While Ellie's feelings for Brandon were sincere, he never demonstrated the seriousness of his intentions towards her. Ellie's friends reported that their relationship was not always smooth. They often argued, including in public. Ellie and Brandon would periodically break up, but then they would be seen together again after some time. On April 12, 2019, Ellie wrote to Brandon that she had taken a pregnancy test and the result was positive, but she received no reply from him. She bombarded him with text and voice messages, but her boyfriend ignored her. Exactly 3 months later, he finally responded, "I don't want a child at all. Seriously, it will ruin my life. I can't help you with this and I don't plan to. It's still very early. Just take a pill or make a doctor's appointment and deal with the issue." Ellie, deeply in love, desperately wanted to meet in person to discuss the situation, but Brandon continually refused. On the fateful Friday of July 19th, Ellie went to a local bar with her friends. At 11:52 p.m., surveillance cameras captured her leaving the bar. She got into a taxi and went home. About 30 minutes later, she received a call. It was Brandon. At 1:58 a.m. on July 20th, Ellie got into Teisfeld's car for her last ride. They headed to an abandoned fishing camp by Sardis Lake. According to police reports, the drive down the dark road to the location was supposed to take about 45 minutes. Witnesses reported clearly hearing gunshots in that area between 2:15 and 2:30 a.m. Investigators contacted Brandon Teisfeld on Sunday afternoon and asked him to come to the station to talk about Ellie Costiel. He found some convincing reasons to avoid coming, but assured the detectives he would meet them on Monday at 8:30 a.m. on Monday, July 22, 2019. After Brandon Teisfeld failed to appear at the police station, investigators began to track his phone. Location data showed that Brandon was heading to his home in Fort Worth, Texas. Authorities issued a BOLO, be on the lookout, for his pickup, which had a distinctive license plate with TAC 3IT. They also alerted all nearby police stations, and the suspect was arrested when he stopped at a gas station in Memphis. 2 days later, 22-year-old Brandon Teisfeld was placed in a local jail and charged with homicide. Teisfeld's lawyer and father claimed he was innocent. As the Oxford community grappled with the violent loss of one of their own, Ellie Costiel's death quickly captured the nation's attention. Reporters eager to learn more about the student and the person charged with her death flocked to Oxford from across the country. Brandon Teisfeld insisted on his innocence until the end, but the evidence against him was more than sufficient. During his arrest, a gun matching the caliber used in the shooting near the lake was found in his possession. His car contained stained clothing, later determined by forensic analysis to be bloodstains belonging to the victim. It was established that after July 12th, Brandon had left Oxford to go home to Texas to retrieve his father's gun, allowing the prosecution to argue that the act was premeditated. His internet search history contained queries such as abortion services and abortion pills. It was later found that each time he agreed to meet Ellie, he canceled at the last minute or failed to show up without explanation. His search history also included queries on how to avoid punishment for a crime, how to conceal a crime, and how to use a weapon. A letter addressed to his parents was discovered in Teisfeld's apartment stating, "I am not a good person. This is not your fault. Something in me just doesn't work. I've always had terrible thoughts. I've always had these feelings. I just felt out of place. I think this is the end for me. I'll either go to jail or die. I know I'll get caught." On August 30th, 2019, a grand jury charged Brandon Teisfeld with the life-taking of Alexandria Costiel. Yet again, he refused to accept responsibility for the incident. Brandon faced the ultimate penalty, capital punishment. However, the trial was postponed due to the widely known restrictions in place at the time due to the COVID-19 pandemic. On August 27, 2021, when the process resumed, Brandon Teisfeld, advised by his lawyer, pleaded guilty to mitigate the potential punishment. He was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. In his final statement, Brandon apologized to Ellie's parents. "My actions have forever changed your life, and the life of my family. I wish I could take it all back, but I can't. I pray for God's forgiveness, and I hope you can find it in your hearts to forgive me too," he said. Cindy Costiel, Ellie's mother, did not accept Brandon's apology, stating that he should spend the rest of his life in prison and that every time his cell doors slammed shut, he should remember the heinous act he committed. Investigator Jarrett Bundren eventually disclosed some already known facts about such a brazen crime to the public. He explained, "Ellie had told Brandon she thought she was pregnant. Brandon didn't want her to keep the baby, and the couple had many arguments about it. Although Ellie wanted to meet in person to discuss the situation, Brandon refused to do so until the day of the incident. Intent on questioning Brandon, the police asked him to come to the station for some inquiries. However, the suspect seemed to resist and continued to make excuses for not being able to come in. Alarmed, the police began tracking his cell phone and realized that Brandon was heading to his home in Fort Worth, Texas. Immediately after locating Brandon, authorities alerted all police departments in the vicinity, and the suspect was arrested when he stopped to refuel at a gas station in Memphis. Upon his arrest, authorities found blood on him. Moreover, a pistol was found in his truck, the caliber of which matched the weapon used in Ellie's demise. Although Brandon insisted on his innocence and claimed he had no part in the incident, the police ultimately charged him with the crime. 5 days after Ellie's passing, normalcy had yet to return to Funky's bar, where surveillance cameras had captured her leaving shortly before midnight on July 19th. Interviews with witnesses, who were among the last to see Ellie, revealed that the management had recently installed a camera right in front of the bar. A bartender, who preferred to remain anonymous, mentioned she had been friends with Ellie since school. Taking a break from her duties, she found the words to describe her friend. She always smiled. She just lit up the room. She had a smile from ear to ear, she said. Ellie was the kind of person who greeted everyone. It's just really sad. She was too kind, she said, looking away as the colorful disco lights danced on her face. We're going to miss her. Ellie's teacher and friend, who taught the Introduction to Retail course, Morgan Hall, learned about the passing of her student the following Monday. She was shocked. You never expect something like this to happen in Oxford and its surroundings. During the interrogation, Morgan mentioned the last time she saw Ellie around 1:15 p.m. on July 19th, when she submitted her test. She left, and I think that evening everything went downhill, she said. Ellie was a sweet girl, very quiet, and I liked having her in class, Morgan stated. After hearing about the student's demise, Morgan immediately went to the administrators to figure out the best way to deal with the situation. According to her, the university had students involved in suicides and fatal accidents, but this was something new. Morgan Hall briefly mentioned Ellie's passing in class. Counselors were ready to assist and were available on campus during that period. Anyone who wanted to postpone their final exams for a few days could do so if they needed time to grieve. My heart goes out to her parents and all her friends, she said. Parents shouldn't have to bury their children. That's not how it's supposed to work. As it turned out, Ellie Kostiel, in her need for support, had told friends that she was pregnant with Brandon Theisfeld's child. Her sisters knew she was pregnant and that she had told Brandon, said a classmate. He was very upset about it, about how it would ruin his life and future. He was angry that she wouldn't have an abortion. She said, "No, I don't believe in that." Another friend mentioned Ellie tried to end her pregnancy through unhealthy methods, like long walks, drinking a lot, and using forbidden substances. She was 17 weeks along. She was struggling with it. Brandon knew about it, but he was seeing someone else. He wanted her to end the pregnancy. I think morally she didn't want to, said Ellie's close friends. He was terrible, and then she would break up with him, or he would break up with her in anger, and then come back to her saying, I'm sorry, and she always took him back. Ellie Kostial's shocked friends and classmates struggled to cope with the news and paid tribute to their friend on social media. It's just hard for me because when I see her face, all I can think about is what she went through, what she thought, what she said her friend Emma Pascoe. It's very, very difficult. On Twitter, one of Ellie's classmates wrote on July 23rd that for years, they had to listen to Ellie and discuss in detail the issues between her and Brandon. He pursued her for many years, using her for his own interests during that time. I spent countless nights holding Ellie, wiping her tears as she cried over this monster for many years, said the now deleted post. You deserve hell, a disgusting excuse for a person. Rex Ravita, a former dorm neighbor of Theisfeld's, shared in an interview that the 22-year-old was a daddy's boy who said he had been seeing Ellie Kostial off and on for many years just for the sake of not being bored. I genuinely believe he emotionally manipulated her into believing he loved her just as she did him, and I think he kept her on the hook until the very last second, said Ravita. Ole Miss student Rex Ravita, a former dorm neighbor of suspect Brandon Theisfeld, later described the alleged perpetrator as misogynistic and arrogant, stating, I'm not going to sugarcoat it. He was very much a daddy's boy. Always had to mention his father's money, how his dad could get him out of anything, just that kind of attitude all the time. Any vulgar comment he could make, any crude remark towards anyone in our dorm, he got away with. On Thursday evening in her hometown of St. Louis, a memorial service was held for Ellie Costiel. At the request of the Costiels, no public statements were made in Oxford about memorial events. Only black ribbons encircling the majestic white columns of the women's houses, including Alpha Phi where Ellie lived, served as a reminder of the tragedy. The young student's demise unsettled the entire state. Meikle Cunningham, a resident of Oxford, mentioned that the case has caught everyone's attention on campus. "This is the biggest news in town since football season for a long time," said Cunningham. "It's just terrible." He expressed hope that the case could be resolved soon, so the Costiel family could find peace. Despite the deliberate withholding of crucial facts for the sake of investigation confidentiality, some news agencies conducted thorough investigations and reported that surveillance cameras captured Costiel on film early Saturday morning, near the location where her body was found. They reported seeing Ellie Costiel with a man, who appears to be Theisfeld, at a 24-hour store in the Harmontown area. Arafat Najib, who has owned this store for about 10 years, mentioned that police officers came to the store on Sunday and asked to review the surveillance camera footage. Najib said that the investigators did not explain why they were there and took some evidence with them when they left. According to Najib, video footage is erased every 72 hours, so there's no way to go back and see what the cameras captured. The business owner stated, "We've never had any problems or violent incidents here. This is a small town. It's quiet. Everyone knows each other. This is just madness." The Lafayette County Sheriff's Office long refused to release any additional information about the progress of the investigation or to give interviews to the media. Rocky Kennedy, the Lafayette County coroner, mentioned that there's a reason officials are not saying much. "This isn't a story that everyone will see until it reaches court," he said. "Certain delicate details in this case are tools to ensure that the person who committed this act is brought before court, convicted, serves the appropriate sentence, and is held accountable for what they've done." Kennedy said the media attention on this case has been overwhelming, but it doesn't change the nature of his work. "Every case I handle is important," said the coroner. "I try to give the same attention to every family who's lost someone. They've lost someone they loved." Michelle Miller, also involved in investigating Ellie Costiel's case, raised questions about missed warning signs in relationships and whether her demise could have been prevented. Brandon Theisfeld was charged with the crime. He faced the death penalty after being accused of Ellie Costiel's demise and alleged abduction. Despite delays caused by the COVID-19 pandemic, justice was served. Eventually, in August 2021, he pleaded guilty to first-degree murder and received a life sentence. Judge Kelly Luther sentenced him to life imprisonment, and he will have the possibility of parole when he turns 65. Brandon Theisfeld is currently incarcerated in the Mississippi State Penitentiary in Sunflower County, Mississippi. At the trial, when the verdict was read, Brandon Theisfeld showed some emotions and sincerely admitted to his involvement in the demise of Ellie Costiel. He acknowledged his guilt in the demise of Alexandria Costiel and was very emotional when he apologized to both her family and his own. A significant fact in this case was the finding of the forensic examination, which established that Alexandria Costiel had never been pregnant. We are left to speculate and ponder why a young and promising student at a popular university, who could have had a happy and fulfilling life, fabricated the existence of a non-existent child and spoke about it to all her friends for 3 months. It seems she sincerely believed in it and thought that this news would melt Brandon's heart and make it belong only to her. Unfortunately, a miracle did not occur. Her parents and friends are still mourning their dear Ellie. According to psychologists, most often teenagers commit offenses for 3 reasons: the desire to assert themselves and gain authority among their peers, alcohol addiction, or addiction to illegal drugs, but most importantly, a sense of impunity. Even for the most serious crimes, minors often receive minimal punishment because their young age is taken into account. In our story today, a schoolgirl named Mackenzie Sherilla became the perpetrator of a terrible tragedy that took 2 lives at once. However, the girl herself did not feel remorse for her crime, and at the trial stated that she could do almost anything while staying alive, but she does not consider herself cool. Mackenzie repeatedly changed her testimony, writing off everything on a lapse in memory, and apparently, until the last moment, was confident that she would get away with it. But the verdict of the judge literally dumbfounded the young criminal and her mother, so desperately defending her daughter. But let's get to the bottom of this. Who is Mackenzie Sherilla? Mackenzie Sherilla was born in August 2004 in the quiet town of Strongsville, Ohio, and was the 3rd child in the family. Her parents, John Sherilla and Natalie Stevens, tried to bring up their heirs in love and care, to give them a good education and encourage all endeavors. The youngest daughter was a family favorite. She was forgiven many pranks from childhood, and even serious misdemeanors often got away with it. Mackenzie grew up capricious, demanding, and selfish girl. She was used to the fact that parents always do as she requires, and was also confident in her own impunity no matter what she did. Classmates and teachers of the girl noted that in childhood she was quite a nice and open child, but with age, her character and behavior began to deteriorate. The girl threw real tantrums. If something went wrong, she easily lost her temper, behaved impudently and impatiently, swore, and could even get into a fight. Mackenzie did not consider anyone's opinion but her own. Her word should always be the last, and she put her own interests above all else. In adolescence, the character of the girl became simply unbearable, but her parents did not see anything terrible in this, believing that her daughter has a transitional age, and she should be treated with understanding and patience. However, bad character was far from the worst of all the troubles. In high school, Mackenzie was addicted to alcohol, as well as sometimes dabbled in illegal drugs, but she got away with it. Often the girl's actions were reckless and carried a direct threat not only to her, but also to the people around her. Parents still did not notice, or simply did not want to notice the obvious problem. Like many of her peers, Mackenzie was a big fan of social media, and literally never let her smartphone out of her hands. She often posted provocative pictures of herself smoking or drinking alcohol on her account, and she left equally provocative comments on them. Mackenzie's friends were just like her. Together they vandalized, organized pogroms, fights, sometimes stole, and several times came to the attention of the police. However, the young people were treated only with warnings and educational talks, which strengthened their belief in their own impunity. Dominique Rousseau, a young man named Dominic Rousseau, was also a native of Strongsville. He was born in September 2001 and was the 4th of 7 children to his parents, Frank and Christine Rousseau. The boy was raised with 3 brothers and 3 sisters, with whom he was always very close. Dominic studied well in school, from childhood years actively engaged in sports, and tried to lead a healthy lifestyle. Despite the fact that he grew up in a large family, neither he himself nor any of his brothers or sisters was not deprived of parental love, attention, and care. Spouses Frank and Christine were moderately strict with their children, but at the same time promoted their all-round development. Dominic always had a lot of friends. He was used to being in the center of attention and became the soul of any company. The young man had a bright and quite attractive appearance, was trim and interesting, so he also had a lot of admirers from a young age. However, he himself tried to avoid fleeting romances, emphasizing serious and promising relationships. After graduating from high school, Rousseau became a student at a local university, choosing the specialization producer of performing arts. He dreamed of linking his life with music and one day becoming a famous music producer. In addition, the talented and versatile Dominic wrote and performed songs himself. By the age of 20, the guy already had his own small business. He bought a car and rented a separate apartment in a good neighborhood. At the same time, he continued to play sports and was considered one of the best students at the university. First love. Dominic and Mackenzie met for the first time when the girls studied in the graduating class. It happened at one of the parties in the company of mutual friends, and this accidental meeting became fatal for both of them. Young people were complete opposites of each other, and opposites are known to attract. A handsome, curly-haired young man, well-versed in music, immediately attracted Mackenzie's attention. He was radically different from the guys she usually socialized with. He was educated, well-mannered, interesting, and could easily hold a conversation on any topic. Mackenzie herself had a striking appearance and slim figure, dressed well, and knew how to make the right impression. She turned on all her charm to draw the attention of the guys she liked, and she managed to achieve the desired rather quickly. In the fall of 2021, the couple began dating, and almost immediately each of them introduced the chosen one to their parents. But if Mackenzie's parents were delighted with her choice and considered Dominic a brilliant couple for their daughter, the parents of the guy had mixed feelings about his passport. On the one hand, the girl looked sweet, innocent, and tried to make a good impression on them. But on the other hand, something in her immediately alerted Frank and Christine Russo. Friends and family members of Cheryl were sure that Mackenzie, for the first time in her life, really fell in love, and sincerely hoped that the relationship with the chosen one will positively affect her character and behavior. Then no one could not even guess what tragedy would end this youthful romance. The couple began to appear everywhere together, holding hands and openly demonstrating their tender feelings for each other. So soon, the whole small town knew about the relationship. Those who knew Mackenzie well sincerely felt sorry for her boyfriend, but most just happy for them. What was wrong with her? Soon Dominic began to notice oddities in his girlfriend's behavior, her defiant antics and desire to make everyone around her do only what she wants. At first, he did not focus too much attention on it, writing off everything on the young age and the desire to attract attention. The young people made plans for their future together, and even planned to get married as soon as Mackenzie turned 18. They also planned to leave their native provincial town and together go to conquer a major metropolis, ideally, New York. There before Dominic would open a lot of opportunities to build a brilliant career in the music industry and fully reveal his talent. But as time went on, Mackenzie's behavior became more and more alarming, and sometimes even frightened the guy. She demanded from her boyfriend that he did only what she wanted, and if he did not agree with her in something, she made scandals, threw tantrums, and behaved like a little capricious child. At first, Dominic tried to translate everything into a joke, but soon realized that this is the true face of his chosen one. In public, she was still trying to hold on, but being alone with her boyfriend spewed on him the whole storm of his emotions, and sometimes even pounced on him with fists. Mackenzie's behavior became more and more aggressive, and at some point, the young man decided that he had enough. He suggested that she take a pause in the relationship and sort out her feelings. But upon hearing this, Mackenzie had a public showdown in front of their mutual friends. She screamed, threatened Dominic that she would kill him if he left her, threatened to burn down his house and wreck his car. But by doing so, she only made him feel more confident that he was doing the right thing by ending this toxic and unrewarding relationship. Obsessive stalking. Mackenzie had no intention of letting her boyfriend go, and at first she acted as if nothing had happened. She continued to called him to various parties and other events, as well as exhibited in social networks of their joint photos, accompanying them with posts with declarations of love. When Dominic firmly told her that everything is over between them, she literally went mad with anger and rage. Mackenzie went to his house almost daily and shouted all sorts of nasty things, insults, and threats under his windows. She called him from different numbers, left messages on his answering machine, wrote on social media, and emailed him. Mackenzie then swore in love and offered to try to start all over again, then again began to insult and threats. Russo was confused. He simply did not know how to react to such behavior, because he had never encountered such behavior. He tried talking, tried to ignore the former lover, and a couple of times even recorded her threatening tantrums on his phone. It got to the point that Sharilla, seeing the ex-boyfriend on the street or in another public place, began to scream and insult him in front of passers-by. She turned Dominic's life into a real nightmare, but he still hoped that a little more time would pass and she would leave him alone, switching to someone else. One day, in front of witnesses, Mackenzie declared that it was easier for her to kill Dominic than to let him go. Mackenzie said that if he didn't come back to her, no one would have him, and she would take care of it. The young man did not take these words seriously, although those around him realized that Mackenzie was not joking. Among the most frequent threats from the mouth of the schoolgirl were promises to hit and run over the guy with a car, as well as to put him in the car and drive off a cliff or stop on the railroad in front of a train rushing at them. Each option sounded terrifying, and each of them Mackenzie described in detail, as if she had planned it all out long ago and was just waiting for the right moment. An unexpected reconciliation. When Mackenzie realized that threats and insults would not help her to get Dominic back, but only distanced him, she decided to change her tactics. Mackenzie became sweet and charming again, stopped pressuring and harassing her ex-boyfriend, and instead tried her best to pretend that she realized her mistakes and wanted to change for the better. She talked about the upcoming enrollment, asked to help her choose a university, and also claimed that she had gotten smart, and most of all was now concerned about the final exams. Such changes pleasantly surprised Dominic. He, in spite of everything, still had tender feelings for the former girlfriend and decided out of kindness to help her with university enrollment. Therefore, they again began to see each other and communicate. Gradually, the couple became close again. Dominic began to invite Mackenzie on dates, sought to spend all his free time with her, and believed that she had changed, matured, became more serious and responsible. He did not notice how he fell in love with her again, and all the former offenses remained somewhere in the past. However, this time the young people were in no hurry to announce to all friends and acquaintances about their reunion. Their meetings were more like secret dates, where they just enjoyed each other's company, avoiding the close attention of others. When Dominic's own brother Angelo learned about what was happening, he suggested that nothing good would come of it, but the young man in love did not heed his words. A devious plan. While Dominic naively rejoiced at being reunited with his girlfriend and the changes he thought had happened to her, Mackenzie herself hatched a terrifying plan of reprisal against the young man. She was so fascinated by the idea of a car and a spectacular car crash that she began to work out this scenario in detail. In her free time, she spent hours driving around the city, choosing a place suitable for the realization of her plan. However, there were no high and steep cliffs nearby, and going out on the tracks while waiting for a train seemed to her an unreliable idea. One day, Sharilla drove into a nearby industrial area, a fairly secluded place with no cameras on the way, and very few cars in the area. The schoolgirl's attention was drawn to a huge brick wall, and her sick imagination immediately conjured up a new, no less horrible plan. She decided that if she accelerated to the maximum possible speed and crashed into the wall, it would be no less spectacular than falling off a cliff into an abyss. It should be noted that initially Mackenzie planned to die together with her lover, so that their story was retold by all the inhabitants of the city. She even told her best friend about it, but her friend simply did not believe in the seriousness of her intentions, because Mackenzie had visited such delusional ideas before, but everything was limited to empty conversations. A terrible realization of the plan and an accidental victim. At the end of July 2022, just a week before her coming of age, Mackenzie suggested to Dominic that they go to an upcoming party hosted by their mutual friends. It would be a good opportunity to have fun, to unwind, and to let everyone know that they were back together and loved each other dearly. The young man readily agreed. He still didn't feel threatened by Mackenzie and believed in the sincerity of her feelings and intentions. The event was scheduled for Saturday, July 30th. Dominic and Mackenzie appeared in the middle of the party, holding hands, which immediately attracted the attention of those present. They looked happy, smiled, and openly showed affectionate feelings for each other. Friends were sincerely pleased with their reunion and noted that they are a very beautiful and harmonious couple. All evening and all night the young people had fun, willingly photographed and without shyness, kissed in front of everyone. But no one even guessed what a terrible tragedy would end this party. The couple drank a little, however, like everyone else at the event, but Mackenzie, secretly from everyone, took a dose of illegal drugs, so to speak, for courage, so as not to change his mind, and at the last moment did not hit the brakes. In the morning, Russo and Sharilla said goodbye to everyone and headed for the car, but then a friend of the guy, Davian Flanagan, followed them and asked them to give him a ride home. Mackenzie tried to object. saying they had plans of their own, but Dominic saw no problem with giving his friend a ride. Not wanting to fight, arouse suspicion, or change plans, Mackenzie agreed, signing Davian's death warrant. Despite her lover's objections, Mackenzie got behind the wheel of the car. Her boyfriend sat next to her in the passenger seat, and her friend sat behind him. The car started and slowly pulled away from the party venue, heading out on its most recent trip. On the main street, Mackenzie drove quietly, keeping to the speed limit and trying not to draw attention to herself. At a stoplight, she stopped, though the road was empty. Mackenzie once again considered her plan, while her passengers dozed off. She later claimed that she wanted to die in the accident, but the perpetrator was obviously lying because she had fastened her seatbelt during the last stop, while her passengers remained unbuckled. When the light turned green, she drove off, quickly picking up speed, and then took a sharp turn onto a poorly lit secondary road leading into an industrial area. Obviously, the guys didn't immediately realize what was going on. If at all, it was as if the devil himself had possessed the driver. The car accelerated to top speed, but Mackenzie continued to press hard on the gas pedal, steering the car into a blank brick wall. A bystander and a miraculous rescue. There wasn't a soul in the industrial area early Sunday morning, so no one saw the accident or rushed to help. Only one woman who lived on the outskirts, not far from the scene of the accident, heard the bang and was not too lazy to go outside to see what was the matter. She saw smoke, and when she got closer, she realized that there had been a car crash, after which she ran back inside to call emergency services. Medics arrived at the scene about half an hour after the accident, but the two guys in the car could not be helped. They died on the spot. The girl behind the wheel was alive. She was saved by her seatbelt and airbags. Mackenzie was unconscious, and her legs were trapped in the mangled car, but she was breathing, and her pulse was clearly palpable, giving hope that she would survive. She opened her eyes several times during the process of being released from the car, but was obviously unaware of what was going on around her. Mackenzie was immediately sent to the hospital, where she was diagnosed with a number of fractures and internal organ damage. Blood tests showed that she was under the influence of alcohol and drugs. However, according to the doctor, perhaps that is what prevented her from dying from painful shock while help was on the way. Investigation, leads, and confession. Initially, the police, having received the results of Mackenzie's tests, assumed that she, being under the influence of illegal substances, simply did not realize what she was doing and perhaps tried to drive through the wall or did not see any obstacles in her way. In favor of this version was the lack of braking distance. It was not possible to talk to Sharilla herself because she was unconscious in the intensive care unit after a complex operation. However, she soon came to her senses and, realizing what she had done, began to sob and pour out her soul to the doctor on duty. She admitted that she purposely drove into the wall at a great speed because she wanted to kill her boyfriend and originally planned to die with him. Mackenzie also added that Davian was an accidental victim due to his own obsession because he asked to go with them. The doctor did not take the patient's rambling story seriously, deciding that it was a delusional state resulting from anesthesia and painkillers, as well as guilt over the death of a loved one. And when the police were allowed to talk to the recovering Mackenzie, she suddenly changed her testimony completely. Now Mackenzie claimed that she remembered almost nothing about the events of that night because she took alcohol and illegal substances. According to the girl, she had a lapse in memory after she got behind the wheel, and how Davian was in the car, she has no idea. However, the facts were to the contrary. The surveillance cameras were able to track the first part of the route the car had taken, and the footage clearly showed that Mackenzie was driving slowly and according to the rules, until she suddenly turned onto a road leading to an industrial zone. Moreover, it turned out that Mackenzie had driven the entire route both ways several days earlier, and her car had been seen there at various times by at least a dozen witnesses. Back to normal. After being discharged from the hospital, Mackenzie recovered quickly enough and tried to get back to her old, carefree life. She had no remorse and was confident that she could get away with it. Mackenzie was once again active on social media, meeting with friends and making plans for the future. In September, she decided to go to a concert of her favorite band playing in a neighboring city. At that time, the bones of her legs had not yet fully fused, But this did not stop her, and she appeared on the concert stage in a wheelchair. At the same time, she wore bright makeup, dressed provocatively, took selfies with friends, and posted them on her account. In October, when Sharilla was on her feet, she went to a Halloween celebration dressed up in a pre-made costume. Mackenzie lived life to the fullest and even made new acquaintances, but on November 4, 2022, she was taken into custody. Trial and sentencing. It took the investigation just over 3 months to gather the necessary evidence and proof to bring the case to trial. Mackenzie was charged with premeditated aggravated double murder and possession and use of a controlled substance that was found in her pocket and detected in her blood. The defendant changed her testimony several times, first citing a lapse in memory, and then, when her friend testified in court as a witness, to whom she revealed her plan, Mackenzie changed tactics, saying that she wanted to die with her lover. But even here there were immediately discovered inconsistencies because she had previously fastened herself with a seatbelt. On August 21, 2023, Sharilla was found guilty of all charges. However, an important nuance was taken into account, namely, at the time of the crime, she was not yet 18 years old. It was 5 days before her majority, so she was tried as a minor. Under state law, she was entitled to at least 2 consecutive sentences of 15 years for each murder, without parole. But because of her young age, she was allowed to serve the 2 sentences concurrently, meaning she would be eligible for parole in 15 years. By then, Mackenzie would be 33 years old. Both sides were unhappy with the court's decision. Family members of the deceased young people said they would seek a review of the case in order to increase the punishment, and parents and Mackenzie's lawyer, on the contrary, considered the sentence too harsh and filed an appeal. However, the judge left the sentence unchanged, noting that he did not believe that Sharilla would leave prison after 15 years. The defendant herself, in his opinion, did not repent for the evil she had committed, behaved arrogantly and even insolently towards the court. But now she will have enough time to seriously consider her heinous act. January 1999. David and Belinda Temple were expecting their second child. Belinda was due to give birth as soon as possible. The doctors predicted labor in a couple of weeks. Like all pregnant women, Belinda was tired very much and quickly, and she still had her son Evan, who also required attention and care. That day, David decided to relieve his wife from household chores and gave her some time for an evening rest. And so that she would not be distracted by anything, he and his son went for a walk in the park. Father and son were having fun. Walking in the fresh air quickly tires and whets the appetite, so after the walk, they went to a cafe to eat a sandwich and drink a Coke. After the cafe, they drove home. David parked the car and noticed that the front door of his house had broken glass. "Evan, I'm going to take you to visit Harlan for a bit, okay?" said David, and without waiting for an answer from his son, quickly led him across the street to a neighboring house where family friends lived. "Why can't we go to Mom's?" asked the son, who could barely keep up with his father. "Mom's in the hospital right now." David couldn't think of anything else to say. Quentin Harlan had barely opened the door to the unexpected guests, and not even had time to say hello before David took his son into the living room without speaking and ran toward his house. Quentin, not understanding anything, shouted to his wife to look after the child, and himself ran after his silent friend. "What's the matter?" Quentin shouted. But when he saw the broken front door of Temple's dwelling, he realized that David probably didn't know what was waiting for him inside. The house was a mess. All the closets were open. Things were scattered on the floor, and worst of all, there were trails of blood on the floor that led to the stairs. Quentin pushed David aside and saw that under the stairs, in the dressing room, Belinda was lying belly down with her arms spread apart and a huge hole in the back of her head. David, apparently out of shock, did not even cry out, did not utter a word, did not rush to his wife's body, but immediately took out his cell phone and dialed the police number. The operator on the other end of the line didn't anticipate the brutality of the murder, so he asked David to check Belinda's pulse and even give her CPR. "What the hell kind of CPR are you talking about? Her head is splattered all over the walls." Police officers immediately rushed to the scene, except they didn't get inside the house for a long time. The Temple family's bull terrier, named Shaq, growled and barked at the unfamiliar uniformed men and seemed about ready to lunge at the police officers. One of the officers even drew his service pistol as David, who had come out of the house, yelled for them to put their guns away and hurriedly took the aggressive dog into the garage. Once inside the house where the tragedy had recently occurred, the police looked around and concluded that the burglars were at work here, who did not know that the mistress was in the house at that moment, and even though she was pregnant, they had no choice but to shoot her and thus get rid of the witness. 1986. Belinda gets a college education in her hometown. Even though her twin sister Brenda left to study at Steve Austin University, Belinda stayed with her parents because in high school, she started dating Marshall Kelmy, who was 3 years older than her and whom she was just crazy about. Her father and mother were against this relationship, at least because of her boyfriend, their daughter would not be able to get a prestigious education and, as it usually happens, would get pregnant early and end up dropping out of even a community college. On this topic, there were many scandals in their home. Carol's mother did not allow her daughter to start a joint life with Marshall and dropped then such a phrase, "He is nobody to you. When you get married, you can move out anywhere, but until then, you have your own house." Belinda was a stubborn girl who always got her way, and she must have taken her mother's words as a wake-up call. Sometime later, at a family dinner, to which Marshall had been invited, despite the inhibitions, the young couple announced that they were to be married. There was a heavy silence at the table. "Well, now that they've decided," Mom gritted her teeth, and they spent the rest of the evening in complete silence. Belinda had actually made the decision herself, wanting to show her parents that she was an adult and capable of making her own decisions. Her boyfriend was not particularly eager for an official marriage, but did not refuse the proposal of his girlfriend, whether he did not want to offend or for some other reason. The two young people got married. No, there was no grand celebration. Belinda wore her sister's white dress, called a few friends, and she and Marshall signed, and then just walked around the city, drinking champagne and having fun. The very next day, Belinda packed her things and moved in with her husband, who at that time still lived with his parents, and rent a separate place was not even planned. Official marriage, in fact, did not affect their relationship, and as already mentioned, Belinda did it all just to stop hearing motherly reproaches and become independent. But the taste of this life turned out to be very bitter. Not 6 months later, Marshall began to spend little time at home, saying he was working late, but was actually with another woman. Belinda found out when she noticed that her husband was acting strangely. One day she waited until his workday was over and followed her husband, and that's when it all came to light. Marshall was walking hand in hand with some strange woman, most likely with his colleague. The deceived wife did not organize any fights and jealousy scenes, but simply packed her things and returned to her mother. The guilty Marshall hung around the doorstep of her house for a long time, often calling on the phone, trying to beg her forgiveness, but Belinda was unshakable and too proud to forgive the young man. They were soon divorced. 1998. Belinda is already pregnant with her second child, but still works part-time at the school. The children listen to her half-heartedly, respect her for her fairness, and even a little afraid. Belinda herself is worried that because of her pregnancy, she will miss the basketball competition between schools, and she will not be able to prepare the team well, because her colleague, Richard Bachman, does not care about her team and children in general. He has confessed to her so many times that if he had another job, he would have given up being a teacher long ago. Belinda disliked this attitude and could not understand how this flabby and fat 40-year-old man was still in his position. Belinda was not one of those teachers who turned a blind eye to student absenteeism. So when she noticed that one of her students, high school senior Riley Joe Sanders, had been absent from class for months, she immediately reached out to her colleagues. She wanted to know if this was her problem as a teacher or if the boy was a systematic truant. Her colleagues answered that it was not her problem. The boy was brought up in a bad family. No one cared about him, and he appeared at school only rarely. Belinda couldn't leave it at that. That same evening, she visited his mother, who lived nearby, and had a serious talk with her, which later bore fruit. However, it wasn't quite what the young teacher had expected. Riley Joe Sanders came to class. practiced on an equal footing with the other students. But during a basketball game, when Sanders pushed his opponent and Belinda pointed out Riley's disgusting behavior, he insulted her with the last words and even said something like, "You'll answer to me for this. You better look around, especially in the evenings." 1987. After breaking up with Marshall, Belinda had nothing left to hold on to in her hometown. So she followed her sister to Stephen F. Austin State University. She loved her time at the university. It seems that she truly found her calling. In addition to studying, she works part-time as a basketball coach, and the young woman had high expectations. At the same university, she meets David Temple. He, like Belinda, is a part-time coach, but for soccer, and also plays for the university team as team captain. Soccer for David was an integral part of life. He practiced it since childhood, and even then it was clear that he would become a star. At school, he always successfully played for his team, for which he was respected by all teachers, even though David had a difficult character. He could easily insult anyone or even beat up, but he got away with it all. Being on the field during the game, he would start with half a turn, and then could not calm down for a very long time. Later, however, one of the players on his team said that David's aggressiveness is due to the fact that he takes steroids. With Belinda, David behaved completely differently, turned into a caring guy who literally could carry his queen in his arms. With one amendment, as soon as someone smiled in the direction of his beloved, as David immediately turned on and tried to clarify the relationship on the fists. Belinda also came to the taste, and David's parents, they literally idolized her. They really liked that she, as well as their son, crazy about sports, which means they have a lot in common. But her twin sister, and in principle Belinda's friends, from this union were, to put it mildly, not thrilled. The whole point is that before meeting David, they knew Belinda as a strong-willed and independent personality, and in this relationship, she changed a lot, became constrained, quiet, humble. It seemed that her whole life was built around pleasing David. In addition to all of this, being in this toxic relationship, Belinda became distant from her family. Calls to her parents became less and less frequent, and trips home, whether for vacations or weekends, stopped altogether. Who in the family could like this? Closer to graduation, the couple got themselves a bull terrier and named their pet, Shaq. And after receiving their long-awaited diplomas, David and Belinda got married. 1999. The police began to examine the crime scene. How could the burglar get into a house guarded by such a vicious dog? In fact, how could the perpetrator distract the bull terrier that prevented the police from making a step into the Temple yard? Then they turned their attention to the front door. The glass was broken, as if the perpetrator had tried to open the lock from the inside, but in that case, the shards of glass would have been near the threshold. But here they were in the distance, to the right of the entrance. So the glass was broken when the door was unlocked. Why would they do that? In the living room, there was a box on a nightstand, with a toppled TV lying on the floor beside it. The policeman opened it. Inside lay earrings, rings, a chain, in appearance resembling gold. Also not clear why the robber did not touch the jewelry. With each new minute spent inside the Temple family home, the police officers came more and more to the conclusion that everything that had happened inside resembled a dramatization. They knew from experience that in a robbery, the criminal takes absolutely everything he can find and carry away. And here, as it seems, nothing was even taken. And then there was that dog that wouldn't leave their minds. Something was clearly wrong here. As for the murder, the shot was fired in the back of the head, presumably with a 12-gauge shotgun, while the victim was kneeling with his back to the killer. That said, a shotgun is not considered a popular weapon among robbers. It's very difficult to carry or transport and still not be seen. In Belinda's case, the murder was absolutely 4 o'clock in the afternoon. A criminal wouldn't be walking around with a shotgun in broad daylight. "David, do you keep any weapons at home?" "Yeah, I have a couple of rifles." David showed his weapons to the police officers, but the shotgun that could have killed Belinda was not among them. The cops asked David to ride with them to the station to give a statement and take an inventory of the stolen items. The man was very nervous, but nevertheless went with the police officers. His son Evan, who did not yet know what had happened, stayed at Harlan's house. 1996. David Temple and Quentin Harlan, in addition to being neighbors, worked at the same school. You could say that they were real friends. They often met outside of work hours to watch games on TV together or have a family barbecue. One day, David and Quentin were brought together by something else besides their love of sports. There was a new young teacher at the school, Heather Scott. Quentin immediately paid attention to her, gave all sorts of signs of attention, and one day even invited her to an evening dinner, but Heather refused him. It so happened that Quentin had a rival, and this rival, surprisingly, turned out to be David. Quentin was beyond angry and resentful that his married friend, who even has a son, was building a secret relationship at work. You have to hand it to Quentin. He was a good friend and could keep a secret. Heather did not even suspect about David's marital status, since he did not wear a wedding ring and did not tell anything about his real life. Moreover, outside the walls of the school, David and Heather behaved like a happy couple, and it was noticed by the whole teaching staff of the school. Belinda knew nothing about David's second life. Once she talked to Quentin and revealed to him that she suspected her husband of cheating, but Quentin, of course, dissuaded the suffering wife. You have a vivid imagination. David is your husband and a great family man. How could you think such a thing? And there was much to think about. If David had previously been extremely reverent towards Belinda, now he could afford to insult his wife even in front of other people, such as, for example, he often called her fat, although after childbirth she only a little weight gained, asked to go to another room when there were guests in the house, as if she scares them with her untidy appearance, and so on. Belinda, instead of having a serious talk with her husband on the subject, accepted this attitude toward herself, but cried at night and felt deeply unhappy as a woman. In parallel, all the while, David was enjoying his new relationship with Heather. 1999. The police suspected David, but they couldn't prove anything. But flipping through the case files of burglaries in the neighborhood, they learned that 8 days before the murder at the Temple house, a house on the next street had been burglarized, and the perpetrator was Riley Joe Sanders. Yes, the same persistent truant from the school where Belinda taught and who had threatened her. He was immediately called in for questioning. Riley had no alibi on the day of the murder, and besides, his father had a shotgun, just a 12 gauge. But when they searched the Sanders house, no weapon was found. When the high school student realized that the police had every reason to detain him, he confessed that on the day of the murder of the teacher, he was with friends, and hid it only because he was with a large group of people smoking pot and did not want to frame others with his testimony. The charge against Riley was dropped. 1998. Because of a new relationship with a coworker, David became further and further estranged from his family. His psychological pressure on his wife grew steadily. He never once raised his hand at her, but all their communication consisted only of insults. It was during this year that Belinda learned that she was pregnant again. This news made her forget about all the past offenses against David, and she felt over the moon. David seemed to be trying to act like a happy father too, but it wasn't working. Sometimes David did not even come home at night, and Belinda was afraid to ask what was the reason for his absence at night, because her husband could get very angry and make a real scandal. A pregnant woman did not want that. Belinda often asked David to help her prepare for the birth of the baby, to go to the store for things, to make repairs in the new children's room, to install shelves on the walls. David ignored all of his wife's requests, and Belinda, although she was in a position, began to do everything on her own, to go shopping, paint the walls, assemble the purchased furniture. David made no effort at all. Christmas was coming. Belinda was already 8 months pregnant. She decided to discuss with her husband what they would give each other, but David suggested that they should not give gifts together this year, and that the money saved would be better spent on the baby that was about to be born, especially since the doctors had warned the expectant mother that she might go into premature labor and the baby might be born before the new year. Christmas came. Although the spouses had agreed not to give each other anything, David never gave Belinda anything, not even a nice little thing. Moreover, he suddenly packed his things and said that all the New Year's holidays will spend with friends on the hunt. Belinda told her sister about it, and she dropped all her plans to come to her so that Belinda would not feel abandoned. and as the doctors warned, labor could begin at any moment. David, of course, wasn't on any hunting trips with his friends. He spent the holidays with Heather, whose neck was decorated with a gold necklace, a gift from Temple for Christmas. 2007. It seemed that David Temple has almost forgotten about the murder of his wife, as if in his life no Belinda Temple had never been. He did not care about the fact that from the moment of the murder has passed 5 years and the culprit has not been found. He married Heather in 2001, and the two of them raised Evan, but back in 2004. In November, there was a knock on his door. On the doorstep stood police officers who, handcuffing David, informed him that he was being held on suspicion of the murder of Belinda Temple. David, as before, denied everything. David's trial did not begin until 2007. According to the investigation, the motive for the crime was his new love affair with Heather. Interviewed colleagues of David said that more than once during Belinda's pregnancy, heard him bragging about how he easily exchanged his fat and pregnant wife for a young and beautiful Heather. According to the prosecution's version, David killed Belinda immediately after she came home from work because the young woman was found in her work uniform and work shoes. He then initiated the robbery by throwing things around the house and quickly drove to the park with his son, which provided an alibi. The prosecution also added such facts that nothing was stolen from the house, and there was a vicious dog in the yard that would not let any stranger into the house. The murder weapon was probably dropped by David in the rice paddy, as there were witnesses who saw David's car stopped near the paddy and only Evan was in the car at the time. However, the shotgun was never recovered in that area. Heather's testimony was that before the murder of Belinda, their relationship with David was not considered serious, and she did not even love him. These words Temple certainly did not like and introduced confusion into the jury's decision. Could David kill his wife for the sake of a non-serious relationship, or Heather is lying, trying to save her husband in this way? In November 2007, David was sentenced to life in prison. 2009. A friend of Riley Sanders goes to the police to clear his conscience. From his words then, a few years ago, Riley told him how he took his father's shotgun with the intention of robbing the Temple family home, and thereby teaching his teacher a lesson about his mother's truancy at school. And he really almost managed to enter the house, but at that moment, a bull terrier ran out of the garage, and Riley shot at the dog, but did not hit, and afraid that the sound of shotgun fire would attract the neighbors, quickly ran away from there. This testimony was submitted to the court. A review of the case began. In the meantime, David was released from prison on bail. Heather had no intention of being the wife of a man who had spent so much time in jail and was not sure how much longer he would spend in jail. She filed for divorce. It took the jury a long time to decide what kind of punishment David deserved. It was when Temple was free, and the court had not yet decided his sentence that the pandemic began. It wasn't until 2023 that the case was revisited. David was found guilty after all. He was sentenced to life in prison with parole after 17 years. His son Evan, while the trial was going on until the last moment, did not believe that his father was capable of such a cold-blooded murder, and throughout the trial, supported him to the last moment.